Chapter 519. It was also raining in Yuzhou. The heavy rain was majestic, and it was more chaotic than that of Lin and Reki City. The heavy rain suddenly arrived at night, roaring through the entire city, swift and violent. In the hidden Dragon Sea, President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State was still standing in his study, watching the real-time broadcast from Reki City in silence. Xia Ji sat on the sofa in the study and drank tea. She looked calm and relaxed, with a faint smile on her lips. Dongqing Wudi sat upright. His gaze was fixed on the screen, his eyes cold and deep. Heavy rain fell from the window, and the rain beat on the window lattice. The study room was lit, and it was quiet. There was only the dazzling light and shadow caused by the flickering of the silent screen. Dongqing Wudi looked at the battlefield on the screen motionlessly, looking more and more focused. Everything was clear. It was so clear that the situation in Reki City was completely clear at a glance. They occupied Reki City at lightning speed, and deterred the 5 Eastern European countries centered on Reki City. The Qin clan advanced and retreated together, and Rekvia surrendered. The Snowdance Corps had an obvious advantage in Reki City in the early stage. Tens of thousands of troops, several invincible realm experts, and many allies. Such a Snowdance Corps was powerful. No one would think that Li Tianlan should not consolidate his advantage. He could even turn his advantage into victory. Therefore, the Snowdance Corps reported to Kunlun City in writing. The Snowdance Corps was a special warfare battalion. When there was a major decision, it naturally had to report to Kunlun City. However, the commander of the Snowdance Corps was Li Tianlan, so such a report was only a situation after all. Gu Xingyun was very tactful and expressed his support in principle. He would not object. It would be useless even if he did. So the Snowdance Corps reported to the military headquarters again. After receiving the report of the Snowdance Corps, Dongqing Wudi secretly discussed with President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State for more than 2 hours, and finally agreed to the action plan of the Snowdance Corps. This plan was not conveyed to the outside world. Not even the most basic procedure to be conveyed to the bigwigs at the counselor level of the Zhongzhou Decision-Making Committee. Therefore, there was no high-level meeting. Only Li Huaqing and Dongqing Wudi knew the plan. So Wang Tianzong would leave the Caesar Hotel, and eventually be imprisoned in the office of the president. Then the plan officially began. This plan seemed to be aimed at the Shadow Throne and Rothschild. In fact, this was indeed the case. But this was also a facade. Rothschild was only the primary target of the Snowdance Corps. Because of the intelligence of Samsara Palace, the real target of the Snowdance Corps was Rothschild's ally. For example, the Violet family. For example, the Morton family. For example, the Eastern Church. In a sense, the chaos in Eastern Europe was the internal strife of the 4 families. Now 2 of the 4 families had united around the Snowdance Corps. If the other 2 families were eliminated, the whole of Eastern Europe would slowly enter the circle of Zhongzhou State under the strong influence of Zhongzhou State. Li Tianlan's plan was insane, but it was also beautiful. Both Li Huaqing and Dongqing Wudi could clearly see the feasibility of this plan. Because the Snowdance Corps had enough strength and advantages. The whole plan went surprisingly smoothly at first. The Shadow Throne was completely disbanded. After the symbolic victory, accidents happened one after another. Paul, who was infinitely close to the peak of the invincible realm, became the most fatal loophole in the plan. In the War of the Dark World, the number of people was naturally crucial. But sometimes it was the strong, or only the strong, who could really affect the overall situation. Paul's powerful strength was the first surprise. The delay of Erisis's entry into the battlefield was the second surprise. In the general trend of the Dark World, only the real strong could affect the overall situation. If Arsis didn't come, it would be difficult for Paul to balance. The betrayal of the holy punishment of Void and Cass Rotter's betrayal were the third surprise. None of this was too fatal. The most fatal thing was the participation of President Charlemagne of the Heroes Club and the Twilight of the Gods. They were originally allies of the Snowdance Corps, but now they were on Rothschild's side. So in an instant all the advantages of Li Tianlan and the Snowdance Corps completely collapsed, and there was nothing left. Li Huaqing looked at the situation on the battlefield. At the same time, he was also looking at the restlessness of the Snowdance Corps in the office of the president. His face gradually became embarrassed. Li Tianlan now had to face 5 Invincible Realm experts alone. And the worst one was in the Invincible Realm on the Divine list. In addition, there were also elites and experts of several major forces. He couldn't see any possibility of Li Tianlan making a comeback. None at all. After tonight, Li Tianlan was bound to die. A 22-year-old expert with the combat capability of the Invincible Realm died. This was equivalent to Zhongzhou State, giving up the absolute dominance in the Dark World in the future 10 or 20 years in advance. Was such a loss a heavy one? After tonight's battle, the Snowdance Corps would also not survive. Tens of thousands of the most elite warriors of Zhongzhou State would be buried in Reki City. This was the combat capability equivalent to at least 100,000 elite troops. Was such a loss a heavy one? After tonight's battle, Reki City, which had originally been obtained, would completely fall into the hands of Rothschild. Prime Minister Rieker would not be spared. Rekvia and the Qin clan, which had just entered the camp of Zhongzhou State, would also be completely destroyed. The forces of Zhongzhou State would withdraw from Reki City, and then even the Arctic Ocean Command of Zhongzhou State would be affected. The more than 100,000 troops were very likely to withdraw from Eastern Europe in compromises. Zhongzhou State's hard work for more than 20 years would be destroyed in a day. Was such a loss a heavy one? After tonight's battle, Zhongzhou State was about to face the most tragic failure in the Dark World in recent decades, or even in recent centuries. And all this could have been avoided. No, even now it could be avoided. Li Huaqing's face was a little livid. He couldn't help glancing at Summer Solstice. Summer Solstice seemed to feel Li Huaqing's emotions. She smiled gently, gentle and dignified, and whispered, "Don't worry, Mr. President. I can represent the Wang family of Beihai. Zhongzhou guarantees that after tonight, Reki City will still belong to Zhongzhou State, and Eastern Europe will also belong to Zhongzhou State." Dongqing Wudi's eyes suddenly flashed with an amazing evil spirit. Summer Solstice's guarantee was very powerful. This was something that they could all see. Because Wang Tianzong was still in Reki City and had not taken action. Wang Tianzong did not take action before because he was too strong. The Wang family of Beihai was too strong. Once he took the initiative to take action, everyone would target him and the Wang family of Beihai. But now it was different. Paul was originally their ally. Even if, at the very least, Rothschild would be blinded by the immediate interests, what did Wang Tianzong have to fear? Li Tianlan was now facing 5 Invincible Realm experts. But if it was Wang Tianzong, he was only facing 5 Invincible Realm experts. This was the gap between Wang Tianzong and Li Tianlan. This sentence was equivalent to saying that as long as Li Tianlan died, Wang Tianzong would take action. It was blatant, without any disguise. This was the final moment. There was no need for any disguise. Everyone knew what each other was thinking. So what if they said it out? Li Huaqing's face was still a little ugly. Dongqing Wudi's cell phone suddenly vibrated. Summer Solstice's eyes moved. There was a text message on Dongqing Wudi's cell phone. It was a blank text message without any content. But the sender only had one word. Shallow. Dongqing Wudi looked at the cell phone, deleted the blank text message, and finally sent another text message. The text message was sent out quickly, and no one knew where it went. He put the cell phone back in place, very gently. For some reason, Summer Solstice suddenly felt that this very light hand carried unparalleled power. It was a kind of sharpness that could destroy everything. The room was quiet for a long time. For a long time no one spoke. The light and shadow on the screen kept changing. Paul was the first to move. Then all the attacks fell on Li Tianlan. Blood dripped. It rained heavily. Li Tianlan stood up again and was crushed by the huge force. Falling stars turned into silver light and flew out of his hand. Lego stamped Li Tianlan's head into the ground with one foot. Dongqing Wudi watched silently, and his whole person seemed extremely quiet. A phone suddenly rang. It was the red encrypted phone in the study. Summer Solstice's heart jumped for no reason. She subconsciously glanced at Dongqing Wudi. Li Huaqing walked to the phone and answered the call. The other party reported something in a hurry on the phone, and his voice was so high that it was almost distorted. Summer Solstice's phone also rang. It was a text message. She looked down and glanced at it, and her gentle and moving face changed dramatically in an instant. Only Dongqing Wudi sat quietly and kept his composure. Li Huaqing took a deep look at Dongqing Wudi. There was thinking and hesitation in his eyes. And finally all the emotions disappeared in his eyes. He put down the phone and slowly sat on the desk behind the desk without saying a word. He no longer looked at the screen, nor did he look at Dongqing Wudi. He just looked out of the window quietly. It was raining and windy. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled. The capital was brightly lit under the heavy rain, but the atmosphere of the whole city suddenly became gloomy, chaotic, oppressive and dark. A dark shadow appeared silently on the wide street. A large number of shadows set out from different places. They appeared on countless roads in Yuzhou City and slowly moved forward. The atmosphere of Yuzhou City, which was still cheerful in the heavy rain, seemed to be completely frozen. In a luxury restaurant, several guests were about to leave after eating and drinking, but their steps seemed to be pulled by someone when they went out of the door. A few seconds later, they returned to the restaurant at the same time. The traffic in the entire Yuzhou City was controlled. The green and red lights kept flashing. The traffic on the streets and alleys passed by in the fastest time. The street was empty, and the emptiness was occupied by the shadows in an instant. The road was roaring. The heavy rain fell, and the thunder roared above the ninth heaven. The dark shadow moved slowly in the heavy rain. The sound of rotors sounded in the air. The sound of rotors echoed in countless corners of the air. One after another, armed helicopters hovered in the heavy rain. There seemed to be a strange roar falling from the sky at a higher altitude. On the ground, the latest main battle tank rolled across the flat street in silence and incomparably domineering manner. Military trucks loaded with heavily armed troops came one after another. Countless. It was silent. Boundless. Tanks, armored vehicles, and infantry fighting vehicles roared past. The atmosphere of the entire Yuzhou City became completely frozen. Armed police, artillery, capital garrison, special brigade, investigation, and special police. More and more legions appeared. The military seemed to have an unimaginable big hand. It reached out in the heavy rain with unparalleled power, and covered the entire Yuzhou City at once. It was sharp enough to destroy everything. At the same time, in several places near the sea, such as Dongshan and Longjiang, a larger army was gathering. The planes took off, the tanks roared, and the bullets were loaded. The tides rose and fell in the sea at night. In several military ports, the sound of warships began to roar and turn. All the way to the north. The north was Beihai Province. The sharp and power that was enough to destroy everything surged unscrupulously in the entire Zhongzhou state, covering the sky, passing through the deep sea, and destroying everything. In the study of the hidden dragon sea, Summer Solstice, who had been silent for a long time, finally couldn't help but speak. Her smile disappeared completely, and her whole person became extremely cold. He looked at Dongqing Wudi. Dongqing Wudi was still calm and collected. "Are you crazy?" Summer Solstice's voice sounded in the silent book. The room seemed a little sharp. "Do you still know what your surname is?" Dongqing Wudi suddenly said. Summer Solstice was stunned. "Of course my surname is Xia and also Wang." "Wang Summer Solstice?" Dongqing Wudi repeated it and nodded. "It sounds like a name of Zhongzhou State." Summer Solstice looked at him as if he were a madman. Zhongzhou State people should do what Zhongzhou State people should do. Dongqing Wudi looked at Summer Solstice and said lightly, "I don't want to name names or say anything, because you know everything." He took out a cigarette, lit it and said slowly, "Mrs. Wang, the Wang family of Beihai has its bottom line, and I have mine." He reached out and pointed to Li Tianlan, who was constantly struggling on the screen. This hand was very powerful. In an instant, Dongqing Wudi changed from the executive minister of the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State to the invincible Zhongzhou State god of massacre, who had been powerful abroad. "This is my son-in-law," Dongqing Wudi said calmly. "I don't care what method you use. I don't care who you inform. And I don't care what happens tonight, but he has to live. Are you reasonable?" Summer Solstice's face was completely red with excitement. Dongqing Wudi smiled and smoked. "I don't have the habit of reasoning with women. You can think about it." Dongqing Wudi stared at summer solstice like a beast. I don't know how long Tianlong can hold on, but it only takes 3 hours from Zhongzhou State to Beihai. During this time, if you can't give me an explanation, I'll give you one. Summer solstice's face changed. It was fast to travel from Zhongzhou State to Beihai, but if it was a large number of troops, it would be very slow. In 3 to 5 hours, they had to fight across the sea. During this time, if Li Tianlong died, when Dongqing Wudi's army arrived at Beihai, it would be a war. A war without suspense. Dongqing Wudi's army could not win. But once the war broke out, the Wang family of Beihai would not win either. Once Beihai and the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State became sworn enemies, how could the Wang family of Beihai gain a foothold in Zhongzhou State in the future? And once the war broke out, how could the Southeast Group deal with itself? Perhaps there was no need to deal with itself. A large number of troops in Yuzhou City had already gone to the place where the backbone of the Wang family of Beihai, such as the Chun family and the Yi family were. Do you know what this means? Summer Solstice looked at Dongqing Wudi and said calmly, "You will die, and everyone in the Dongqing family will die because of your decision." Dongqing Wudi's eyes flashed with coldness, and he said in a gloomy tone, "So what? Once the war breaks out, the Dongqing family will be destroyed, and the Wang family of Beihai will be no better. If we can't fight, we will die together. Today, I will play with your Wang family of Beihai with my life. Do you dare?" He pulled his military uniform and said with a sneer, "You've been breaking the rules. If I don't play with you seriously, I'm really afraid that you don't even know what your surname is." At the same time, the fighting outside the battlefield of Reki City was still going on. The elites of the Snowdance Corps, which had become fewer and fewer, were crazily attacking the formation of Rothschild and the Eastern Church. The most elite warriors of Zhongzhou State fell one by one, in batches. But the entire Snowdance Corps had gone completely crazy. They wanted to rush into the center of the battlefield, regardless of life and death and sacrifice. The elites of the Men in Black and the fantasy world were getting fewer and fewer. The elites of the Vatican were also demoralized with the escape of Melad and Arsis. The army of Wulan State rushed up under the cruel military order. They still had the most people so far. But several members of the Devil Troop were like war machines that lived to kill these people. The red light kept flashing in the crowd. Wherever the gaze of the Devil's Eye fell, blood would rise in the next second. The morale of the Knights of Light, the elites of Rothschild, the elites of the Morton family, and even the elites of the Violet family could be said to be high. Everyone's eyes were completely bloodshot. They desperately rushed and killed in the crowd, desperately weakening their opponents. The wind and rain became more and more violent. The night was getting darker. Countless rays of light suddenly lit up in the gradually silent night. The wind and rain suddenly became chaotic. Bright and subtle rays of light came from all directions. Under the wind and rain, extremely heavy footsteps suddenly sounded on the chaotic battlefield. The footsteps were heavy and violent, and the speed was extremely fast. In just a few seconds, a few silent and fierce figures appeared at the end of the block. The white light was their eyes. Or rather, it was their gaze. Whoosh! Above the sky, the heavy rain and the night sky seemed to be completely torn apart at the same time. Under the great power, an arrow broke the sky in an instant and fell directly into the crowd of the Knights of Light. The body of a commander of the Knights of Light shook violently, and he lowered his head in astonishment. But before he could see his injury clearly, his whole body had been shot into a mass of flesh and blood. The arrow light passed through his body and smashed a group of elites of the Knights of Light in an instant. Then the great power slowly disappeared. The crowd was silent for a moment. No one knew who shouted first. "It's the String of Rainstorm." The String of Rainstorm. One of the 4 spirits armors of Zhongzhou State, exclusive to Vermilion Bird. Boom. In another direction, a large piece of sword light suddenly rose to the sky. The sword light was vigorous and piercingly cold. It smashed everything in the whistling, like a storm flying. 24 moves of sword. And there were 24 moves of sword. One of the sword light belonged to Lin Yuxian, the young master of the Lin clan. The other sword light belonged to Li Wangsheng, the lieutenant general of Black Tortoise of Zhongzhou State. Amidst the chaotic battlefield, A white-clothed middle-aged man appeared in front of a demon. For the first time, the invincible devil troupe showed a little hesitation. Gong Sun-chi, who was dressed in white, glanced at him and raised his eyebrows. "Do you know me?" The devil did not speak, but the red light in his eyes was flashing rapidly. "If you know me, don't move." Gong Sun-chi reached out and patted the devil's face. With a cold smile he said, "If you move, I'll kill you." Apex. Chapter 520. The Dark World had always been big, but there had never been many Invincible Realm experts. So most of the time, almost all Invincible Realm experts had karma. Karma was also a fetter. If a person had no fetter, he would naturally become a lonely ghost. Without fear, an Invincible Realm expert would become a powerful lonely ghost. Before the chaos in Eastern Europe broke out, there were 3 Invincible Realm experts on the divine list in Eastern Europe. Patriarch Hustile. His fetter was the Eastern Church. Tyrant. His fetter was the Polar Ground Alliance. Lagos Morton. His fetter was the Morton family. But now Li Tianlan told Lagos that the Morton family was destroyed. The moment he heard the news, Lagos suddenly realized a problem. Tonight, the battlefield in Reki City was extremely tragic. Several Invincible Realm experts died. The casualties of the thunder-shocking realm experts were countless. But from beginning to end, he had never seen any high-level member of the Snowdance Corps. Some important figures of the Snowdance Corps were famous even in the entire Dark World. Li Zhonghu of the Border Control Corps. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud of Sai City. The Yin and Yang Phantom of Mount Shu. The Sword Justice and First Elder of Jade Pool. None of these people showed up. Lagos had no doubts. Since he heard the news announced by Li Tianlan, he knew where the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps had gone. When he, Violet, and Hustile rushed to Reki City from their headquarters, the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps actually took the elites to their lair while they were away. This was an extremely crazy plan. But Lagos believed it was true, because Li Tianlan was a madman. And at this time, it was meaningless for him to say some false news to provoke him. So the Morton family was really destroyed. It was destroyed in the hands of the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps. An indescribable rage and resentment completely filled Lagos's mind. His eyes were red, and his blood was boiling in his body. He had completely lost his mind, and all his attacks fell on Li Tianlan. He would not kill him so easily. This man had destroyed his family. He wanted him to live a life worse than death. Crack. Crack. The great power was mighty. Li Tianlan's ribs were broken one by one. The tremendous force was tearing every inch of his muscles and bones bit by bit. His face was pale and his muscles were contorted. But under the tremendous force, he still tried to stand up again and again. The real and illusory sword intent rose and fell around Li Tianlan. And the great power and wind and rain could never erase that glimmer of sharpness. He still wanted to stand up. They still had to attack. Even if he didn't have the slightest ability to retaliate. His head pushed up against Lagos's foot. Lagos stepped on it again and again expressionlessly. Li Tianlan's consciousness began to blur. His hands were tightly gripping the pair of feet in front of him. His feet stood motionless in front of Li Tianlan. "Do you know what your biggest mistake was?" Morton's cold and twisted voice sounded beside his ear. "That is, you destroyed my family, but you don't have the ability to destroy me. As long as I'm here, the Morton family will not disappear. I will not kill you so easily. I will destroy everything related to you. Was the Li family that great? Look, you, the heavenly son of the Li family, are nothing under my feet. Tomorrow I will go to Zhongzhou State. I want you and the Li family to kneel in front of me like dogs. You will become the shame of the whole Zhongzhou State and the laughingstock of the world. You asked for it." Bang. Lagos raised his foot and kicked Li Tianlan far away. In the cracking sound, the ribs in his chest had been completely broken. His consciousness was blurred and his breathing became difficult. But there was still a pair of feet in front of him. The pair of feet seemed to fly up with him, and then landed on the ground. Li Tianlan was in a trance. He exerted a little force in his palm to make sure that it was really a real thing. Cough, cough. The heavy rain fell on the ground, and the dirty rain poured into his mouth with the taste of blood. He coughed violently and spat out more blood. His body struggled slightly, and he wanted to stand up. If you continue to be brave, you will die. A calm voice suddenly sounded. It was faint and a little distant, but compared with the wind and rain and killing intent, this voice had a touch of warmth. Who is it? Li Tianlan asked. His mouth was full of blood, and his voice was extremely vague. At most, you can stand up 2 more times, and Lagos will destroy the foundation of your whole body. After that, even if you can live, you have no hope of being invincible, and you can't even touch martial arts. Are you willing? The voice continued to sound. He had never been able to suppress his voice. But neither Lagos nor Paul heard his voice, nor did they see him. He stood there, extremely illusory and perfect. There was no reality at all. Who is it? Li Tianlan's voice was weak and hoarse, and he still asked the same question. Why don't you run? The voice asked calmly. You had a chance to leave before. If you left here, you could have left without going back to Zhongzhou State. With your aptitude, it is very likely that you will reach the top of the divine list within 10 years. Why do you want to die here? Stupid and cowardly. Li Tianlan laughed. His voice was low, and he was panting rapidly. He was vague and extremely hoarse. I can run, he panted. I have time. But what about the Li family? What about my Li family? His smile was bleak, but with a kind of persistence that he would rather die than give up. I have time, but my Li family doesn't. He would rather die than give up. He did not dare to give up. He clenched his fist and hammered the ground hard. The ground splashed with tiny raindrops, making him look even dirtier and more embarrassed. This is Reki City, the Li family's Reki City, that I conquered. How can I run? Everyone can run. Tell me, how can I run? He was now the youngest invincible realm expert in the dark world. His martial arts were extremely perfect. He was the youngest marshal in the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State. The dark world even recognized that he would become the future chosen one. He had friends in Zhongzhou State who could share life and death with him, seniors who were willing to take risks for him, and tens of thousands of soldiers who were willing to die for him. He even had the most beautiful woman in the dark world. He had a bright future and a respected status. But until now he still couldn't help but recall his childhood. He had no childhood when he was young. There was only the Li family. The Li family that was so stuffy that it made people desperate. The Li family that was so oppressive in the cemetery that it made people breathless. The Li family that could even eat a good meal could be said to be a dream. The Li family that was incomparably broken and no longer had any glory and light. The Li family that a group of people persisted without complaint or regret. They were silent, but they were willing to support him and his grandfather with everything. He was with that group of people every day. He was in a precarious situation. They were like a group of wild dogs. Li Tianlan suddenly felt extremely guilty. He didn't feel that he was shouldering too much and too heavy a burden. His surname was Li. This was something he should bear. But he really felt guilty, because he couldn't fulfill his promise after all, and didn't let the Li family return to the peak. Countless hopes were all lost at this moment. He ruined all of this. Li Tianlan lay in the rain, his body trembling. Blood and tears mixed in the dirty rain and completely merged. He thought that his will was invincible, and he could bear everything. It turned out that when he was really in a desperate situation, he was still a little weak. The light of the future began to gradually become dark. In a blur, all of his confidence seemed to have been completely crushed. It turned into guilt, weakness, confusion, and tears. His palms were tightly clasped together, and his body kept trembling. He stood in front of him, lowered his head, and looked at the child who didn't dare to make a sound even if he cried. 22 years old. He was indeed a child. His eyes were calm, but they were extremely heavy. This kind of heavy weight was borne by the child. For many years, many things and many situations, he had gritted his teeth and endured it. He was extremely calm and extremely crazy. Only when the child really couldn't bear it did the weight completely collapse at once. Such a collapse was so violent that all the weight seemed to be on him at once. So he also thought of the small mountain village on the border of Zhongzhou State. He thought of what some of his brothers had told him. They were like a group of wild dogs. He suddenly smiled and took a step back. The lights in Reki City were hazy, and the heavy rain was pouring down. He turned his head and looked in the direction of the office of the president. The office of the president was calm. There was no mighty sword light that was 10,000 meters long. The eyes of Paul and King Tong were still cruel. He was silent for a while. He knew what was happening in Zhongzhou State. He also knew what Summer Solstice would think. So he didn't believe that Summer Solstice would not call Wang Tianzong in such a situation. But Wang Tianzong still remained silent. He knew what Wang Tianzong was thinking. It was like Wang Tianzong knew what he was thinking. He didn't make a move, but he was forcing Wang Tianzong to make a move. Wang Tianzong didn't make a move, but he was forcing him to make a move. Wang Tianzong wanted to force him to make this sword move. His best sword move. So he laughed again. The weight was on him. What could he do with this sword move? In the final battle, the peak was not there, and the sword intent was not enough. What could he do? So he took another step back. This is what you should bear. You solve it yourself. He spoke slowly in an indifferent tone. Li Tianlan didn't speak. His body struggled to get up again. But the great pain and weakness made him fall in the rain again. Stand up, he said calmly. This is your own failure. No one will turn the tables for you. Li Tianlan gritted his teeth and stood up little by little, but he was still wobbling. An incomparably illusory sword energy appeared quietly and wrapped Li Tianlan up. Li Tianlan's body shook violently. This kind of sword intent was so familiar, like the most instinctive feeling. He turned his head and looked ahead. At this moment he finally saw the other party's face clearly. It was a very ordinary face. It was very ordinary, but it was not real. It became extremely illusory. It's you, Li Tianlan said softly. The sword intent completely wrapped his body. His aura was extremely restrained, but it forcibly stabilized his injury. His realm did not break through the invincible realm. But with the help of this sword intent, his combat capability began to soar wildly in an instant. Invincible realm. Stabilizing the invincible realm. Close to the peak of the invincible realm. Peak of the invincible realm. Peak of the invincible realm. An unprecedented feeling rose in Li Tianlan's heart. An unimaginably vast and majestic sword chi revolved around him. This was the real top sword energy at the peak of the invincible realm. This sword energy was extremely docile, only waiting for the perfect sword intent of his own martial arts to cooperate. Li Tianlan's eyes were a little dazed, and he didn't even dare to move again. At this moment, he couldn't imagine how powerful he was. It seemed that as long as he raised his hand, he could easily tear the whole sky. Why? Li Tianlan suddenly asked. He looked at the man in front of him as if he had seen the whole purgatory. Purgatory of heaven capital. Deity. You're right about one thing. Deity said indifferently. No matter who the Li family belongs to in the future, Eastern Europe should belong to the Li family. This was the place he had not conquered back then. This was the place where he was forced to compromise back then. The Li family was stubborn. He had fought here back then, so this place naturally belonged to him and the Li family. No matter who the Li family belonged to, this place could only belong to the Li family. Get them all out. Deity pointed at the 5 invincible realm experts in front of Li Tianlan, and said casually. Li Tianlan laughed. His face was dirty, but the perfect sword intent was ready to move. The mighty sword intent whistled up and down. He stood in the center, but there was a kind of unparalleled elegance. Li Tianlan closed his eyes. Everything around him seemed to be in his perception. He sensed the twilight of the gods was ready to move. He sensed the slight tremble of falling stars. Li Tianlan needed a sword. But it was not falling stars. He opened his eyes, looked at the place of the office of the president, and reached out his hand. Your Majesty, please lend me your sword. His voice was very soft and did not echo between heaven and earth. But at the same time, the entire office of the president suddenly trembled violently. Every house was shaking. The wind and rain suddenly became chaotic. An indescribable mighty sword intent covered the office of the president in an instant. In Wang Tianzong's room, listen to the sea shook violently, and the sword energy was awe-inspiring. Wang Tianzong, who was drinking tea, suddenly smiled and did not stop anything. In the next second, a bright light flashed across the room. Listen to the sea suddenly came out of its sheath. The blade pierced the window lattice, cut through the wind and rain, and rushed straight to the battlefield. Lagos had rushed over. He said that he would make Li Tianlan's life worse than death. Then he couldn't stand still. For a long time to come, he would make Li Tianlan kneel in front of him or lie down in front of him, until the Li family was completely destroyed. Bang, bang, bang. Lagos ran with big strides. The rain splashed under his feet. The whole battlefield seemed to be trembling under his feet. He was getting closer and closer to Li Tianlan. He jumped directly into the sky, as if he wanted to step Li Tianlan into the ground again. Li Tianlan glanced at him. A sword light came from the distant sky, as fast as lightning, like a meteor. Li Tianlan raised his hand and played it down, but Lagos's figure suddenly froze in the air. Lagos's pupils suddenly contracted, and his face was full of disbelief, which soon turned into fear. There was silence between heaven and earth. Thunder was about to roar. Death was coming. The perfect sword intent spread out. Li Tianlan's palm suddenly burst out an extremely dazzling sword light. The sword light was magnificent and vast, clear and dazzling, real and illusory, extremely perfect. The sword light bloomed in front of Li Tianlan, and went straight into the sky in an instant, mighty and mighty. The 10,000-meter-long sword intent tore the sky in an instant, roaring like a dragon. From the ground to the clouds, the sword light passed through Lagos's body. Puff! Without any suspense, Lagos's body completely burst into a blood mist in the Jianguangxia, leaving nothing. The sword light in the distance pierced the night sky. Li Tianlan's hand continued to rise and finally held the sword. Listen to the sea. Apex. Chapter 521. Thunder suddenly roared. Death came crashing down. The sword light that went straight into the starry sky from the ground was like a wild dragon, vast and infinite. In an instant, it became the most dazzling light in the whole city. Lagos's body collapsed under the sword energy and melted quickly in the sword light. Blood, broken bones, and even hair turned into dust, scattered in the wind and rain, and finally disappeared without a trace. Li Tianlan looked down at Listen to the Sea in his hand. Listen to the Sea shone with clear light, docile and sharp. This sword was supreme in the Wang family of Beihai. It was also supreme in the dark world. It was just like his current combat capability. His sword intent had been extremely perfect, and the only thing he lacked was the sword energy. Deity helped him make up for the most fatal shortcoming. At this moment, Li Tianlan went straight to the peak of the invincible realm with the foundation of the Chosen One. In today's dark world he was indeed supreme. The Chosen One was supreme. He was not the Chosen One yet, but with the sword energy at the peak of the invincible realm, only Wang Tianzong was qualified to stand side by side with him in the whole dark world. Li Tianlan looked at Listen to the Sea in his hand, and was silent for a while. Listen to the Sea was the most famous sword in the dark world. He could feel the sharpness of Listen to the Sea, but vaguely, it seemed that something was missing and something was suppressed. This feeling was subtle, but it was crucial, because at this moment, his sword intent and sword energy were too strong, so even the first famous sword in the dark world could not make his sword intent fully exert. How do you feel? Deity's voice was clear and light. He stood beside Li Tianlan, but he did not appear in front of anyone else. The space within dozens of centimeters around him turned into nothingness with him, perfectly merging with the night. Wang Tianzong needs to change a sword. Li Tianlan suddenly said. Deity's sword energy appeared beside Li Tianlan without reservation, and slowly merged with his sword intent. The sword energy and sword intent of the same origin merged very smoothly. This also made Li Tianlan's combat capability soar to an incredible level, temporarily becoming the top expert at the peak of the invincible realm. In this way, Li Tianlan's realm was slightly lower than Wang Tianzong's. But Wang Tianzong's sword intent was also slightly lower than Li Tianlan's. In this state, as long as deity did not withdraw the sword intent, Li Tianlan could fight with Wang Tianzong. In other words, Li Tianlan's sword was more powerful than deity himself. Listen to the Sea could not bear his sword intent. Naturally, it could not bear Wang Tianzong's sword intent either. He suddenly remembered Qin Weibai's words. Qin Weibai said that she would give him a sword that could match his future. If such a sword really existed, it would definitely surpass Listen to the Sea. Did the Wang family of Beihai have a sword more terrifying than Listen to the Sea? He was in a trance. He didn't even care about Paul and King Tong, who were a little stunned. He looked at God and suddenly spoke seriously. I suddenly feel like a beggar. You want to borrow sword Qi, and you want to borrow swords? Is it funny? Deity was silent for a moment. You carry a lot of things on your back, he said, but you're not the only one who bears a lot of burdens. What happened tonight, after all, is the Li family's own business. In Linan, in Eastern Europe, both Li Honghe and Lin Fengting said the same thing. Deity said the same thing to Li Tianlan. The Li family was stubborn. Stubbornness was also pride. So he never thought about the lack of sword energy when facing Wang Tianzong in the final battle. That was why he hadn't shown up before and waited until all the Invincible Realm experts had left the battlefield. Therefore, even though he knew that Wang Tianzong would take action at the last minute because of Zhongzhou State, he still lent the sword energy to Li Tianlan. The army headquarters of Zhongzhou State would give up all actions because of this incident. God does not need this. Because it was the Li family's own business. Was it necessary to use the sword of Beihai to deal with the Li family's affairs? Deity glanced at Listen to the Sea and said calmly, this sword cannot be used. Then I'll give up. Li Tianlan said calmly. He turned around, leaving his back to Paul and King Tong, and looked in the direction of the office of the president. King Tong's eyes moved. The next second, Li Tianlan gently flicked his fingers. Thank you, Your Majesty. Buzz. Between the heavens and the earth. A buzzing sound suddenly rang out under the torrential rain. Near the battlefield, several Rothschild elites had surrounded dozens of members of the Snowdance Corps, and were ready to kill them. A buzzing sound rang out. Listen to the Sea flew out. The rainbow streaked across the sky. In an instant, it was earth-shattering. The sword light instantly burst out on the blade of Listen to the Sea. Listen to the Sea cut through the air, and an extremely deep crack suddenly appeared on the ground of Reki City. The crack moved forward crazily with the shooting of the sword light. The roads were collapsing, and the buildings were collapsing. The gravel, the smoke, the spilling blood, the misty lights, and the wind and rain in the sky were all driven by this sword, which was vigorous and vigorous. The elites of Rothschild, who were just about to make a move, were brushed by the sword light, and several elites instantly burst into a mist of blood. The sword light was still moving forward, getting higher and higher. The bright sword light was constantly lengthening in the air, and its speed had reached the limit. The whole city was roaring. The deep cracks on the ground moved forward crazily with the sword light. It was hundreds of meters, thousands of meters, and thousands of meters. Boom! The sword light passed through the tall buildings of Reki City. On the ground, the ordinary shops were torn apart by the spreading cracks. Everything was driven down by the smoke and dust. The sword light that was thousands of meters long was still flying endlessly. The cracks were still spreading, tearing the roads and shattering the blocks. The crazy sword energy lifted everything up, brought it into the air, and covered the sky. Paul looked at the sword quietly. His eyes were filled with horror. His breath was full of despair. An unimaginable sharp edge was raging wildly in Reki City. The sword energy was 10,000 meters long. The sky was full of sword light. The office of the president was shaking like never before. The sword light drove heaven and earth, as if a real and illusory world was rumbling over. This sword was only ruthless. This sword was only swift and fierce. This sword was only arrogant. Wang Tianzong stood in front of the window and calmly looked at the 10,000-meter-long sword light that almost tore half of Reki City apart in an instant. He looked around and reached the sky, tracing back time to eternity. It was all real. It was all illusory. It was all a sword strike. It was as fierce as the west wind. The sword light tore the square in front of the office of the president. The star flag of Zhongzhou State was fluttering in front of the square. The ground was constantly being torn apart. The huge cracks spread from 10,000 meters away with the sword light, and directly hit the office of the president. That ruthless and extremely arrogant sharpness had finally arrived. The majestic and heavy office of the president was completely torn apart in an instant. The sword light shattered the gate, the garden, the rockery, and stirred up a pool of water in the office of the president. The water light all over the sky brought about a pervasive mist. This sword directly arrived in front of Wang Tianzong. The sword light was vast, like the starry sky and the world. Real and illusory were constantly changing. It was ethereal. It was invincible. The sword light was like a mountain or a sea. In front of the sword light, Wang Tianzong's figure was like a star or dust. Wang Tianzong stood motionless in front of the window. He reached out his hand. In an instant, the aura on his body was directly restrained to the extreme. His palm glowed. It was subtle and hazy. The listen to the sea sword rushed over. He reached out and flicked. Endless power burst out in an unimaginable way in an instant. The spreading cracks stopped in front of Wang Tianzong's room in an instant. The sword light stopped for a moment, and the endless edge suddenly began to retreat as if pushed by something. Countless rays of light withdrew from the office of the president and completely exploded in the square in front of the office of the president. The power was surging and sweeping everything away. The square, which was enough to support the military parade of Wulan State, was completely destroyed in an instant. 10,000 meters away, Li Tianlan's whole arm was instantly bleeding. Wang Tianzong held the blade of Listen to the Sea and put the long sword back into the scabbard expressionlessly. He walked back to the room, sat down, and poured himself a cup of tea. But all he could think about was the warning meaning contained in this sword strike. Blood flowed down his cuffs. It dyed his sleeves and wet the table. Wang Tianzong seemed to be unaware of it. He picked up the teacup and took a sip. The tea was cold. It was slightly bitter. It was. Chapter 522. Li Tianlan lowered his head and looked at his arm. The blood turned into countless tiny blood vessels and sprayed out like a small fountain in the night. His arm trembled slightly, but his eyes were extremely calm. He and Wang Tianzong were only a little short of perfection. Judging from the result, Li Tianlan was slightly at a disadvantage, but the slight gap was almost negligible. With the help of deity's sword energy, this was the first time he stood at the top of the whole world. It was also the first time he fought with the top figure in the dark world. It seemed that it was not until this time that his state of mind really sublimated to the peak state with this sword. This sword had no respect for anyone. This sword was insufferably arrogant. Under the sword light, his will could wreak havoc in the dark world unscrupulously. That feeling could only be described with the simplest word: invincible. The invincible realm was invincible. The sword light 10,000 meters away was still roaring and surging. The office of the president was completely overturned. The huge square in front of the office of the president was broken. The huge force almost flattened the entire block near the office of the president in an instant, and finally slowly dissipated. Li Tianlan looked into the distance and said calmly, "Thank you." Deity stood beside Li Tianlan and said lightly, "Thank you." If he joined forces with him, they would represent the currently family. If he joined forces with him, they would be invincible in the world. Under the heavy rain, the sword intent and sword energy of the two completely merged. Deity saw Li Tianlan's martial arts clearly. Li Tianlan also saw Deity's martial arts clearly. This earth-shattering sword not only tested Wang Tianzong's attitude, but also let Li Tianlan see his future path. Vaguely, he seemed to really touch the threshold of how to step into the invincible realm in the most perfect posture. The road was ahead. It was very far. He needed time. He took a step forward. He looked at Paul, at Charlemagne, at King Tong, and at Husteel. Lagos had fallen. The faces of the remaining 4 invincible realm experts were extremely ugly. The 4 of them had completely lost control of their emotions, with embarrassment, shock, and fear. All the emotions were expressed on their faces. Li Tianlan moved forward slowly. After that earth-shattering strike, his eyes calmed down. Perhaps no one knew why he fought with Wang Tianzong first. However, in that sword light that was enough to tear apart the heavens and the earth, he had obtained many answers. Answers about the present, the future, himself, and his enemies. His eyes became even more tranquil and deep like an ocean, without any undulations, yet incomparably vast. King Tong stared at Li Tianlan's footsteps. Her face was a little pale. The corners of Hustiel's mouth twitched slightly as he muttered something to himself. Charlemagne clutched the twilight of the gods in his hand and said nothing. Paul suddenly glanced at Li Tianlan, then looked behind Li Tianlan and asked, "Who's there?" It was impossible for Li Tianlan to suddenly become so strong. The only explanation was that a real expert lent his sword energy to Li Tianlan for the time being. He was the expert closest to the peak of the invincible realm in the dark world. However, he was also powerless to resist the sword light just now. So his expression was calm, but his voice was trembling. No one spoke. Li Tianlan kept walking forward. "What do you want?" Paul looked at Li Tianlan, and his expression suddenly became extremely sincere. "Maybe we can talk." "You should have killed me just now," Li Tianlan said. Of course he wanted to talk, but he didn't want to talk with his mouth. He raised his palm. There was another buzz between heaven and earth. But there was no sword intent. In an instant, the rain in the whole block was swept away. The sky was silent, and the huge sword intent occupied the field. It seemed to fall from the sky, but it also seemed to rise from the ground. The falling rain disappeared, and the starlight fell. The starry sky also fell. The whole world was dead silent in an instant. The sky and the earth pressed down at the same time, irresistible. There was no sword energy in this sword strike. Because the sky, the earth, and all directions had turned into swords. It was a pure, integral sword. Hustiel's face was distorted. He seemed to be roaring something, but there was no sound. Paul's expression changed dramatically. Charlemagne raised the muzzle of his gun. King Tong was screaming. But everything was extremely silent. With one sword strike, the world was silent forever. Li Tianlan raised his palm, and put his fingers together like a sword. In the absolute silence, Paul took a step forward. King Tong stood beside him. Charlemagne and Hustiel moved forward. Shadows filled the air. The light lit up. The domains of the four people were overlaid crazily, and then they began to gather to the limit. At this moment, Li Tianlan could fight against Wang Tianzong with his sword. Li Tianlan couldn't resist this. They were no longer thinking about fighting, but how to get out of Li Tianlan's hands. Snowdance Corps, Dark Knight's Retreat. Li Tianlan's voice suddenly sounded. In the absolute silence, his voice was loud and majestic, becoming the only voice. The domains of the four invincible realm experts overlapped and condensed into a ball of light that could just wrap them up. The ball of light flickered, extremely thick and smooth. This was the strongest defensive means of the four people now, and they didn't hold back at all. Li Tianlan was expressionless. He had no sword in his hand, but his sword-like fingers moved forward slightly. Endless light fell from the sky, light and ethereal, but extremely magnificent. All the light gathered at Li Tianlan's fingertips. The starlight all over the sky turned into a beam of light in his hand, like sword light. The sword light stabbed the ball of light in front of the four invincible realm experts. The smooth ball of light suddenly wrinkled, like ripples on the water, spreading layer by layer. The sword light froze for a moment. Li Tianlan's eyes suddenly lit up, and his sword intent turned. There was a roar everywhere between heaven and earth. The mountains and rivers were no longer silent, and began to break. The 21st blade shatter of land. The mountain-like sword light surged over. Li Tianlan's body was glowing, extremely dazzling. Everything nearby was shrouded by the sword light. The sword light occupied the sky and the ground. The whole battlefield was as bright as day in an instant. Behind Li Tianlan, Deity's pupils suddenly contracted. Looking at this sword, his eyes were filled with relief, killing intent, pain, and incomparably complicated. Li Tianlan's sword was neither real nor illusory, but it was also flawless. When the day was extremely bright, it became night. Day and night alternated in an instant. The sword light in Li Tianlan's hand completely burst out in an instant. Boom! The domains condensed and superimposed by the four invincible realm experts were instantly shattered. The huge domain spread and exploded. It stirred up heaven and earth. In the endless turbulence of power, Li Tianlan walked in expressionlessly. So indifferent, so majestic. Ah! Hustiel's heart seemed to have completely collapsed. His white robe flew up, and the blazing white light began to bloom all over his body. The light of heaven was burning on him. It was burning all his strength and potential. His face was distorted, and with crazy killing intent, he rushed over like a glowing cannonball. Li Tianlong glanced at him. His eyes were silent. But 4 streaks of sword energy appeared at the same time in the 4 directions of north, south, east, and west. The sword energy fell from the sky with starlight, and turned into 4 natural arcs of light. The arcs of light pulled heaven and earth. In a flash, they arrived in front of Hustiel almost in an instant. The 4 sword intents crossed each other. Bang! The invincible realm expert with the strongest combat capability in the Eastern Church. The domain of the invincible realm expert, who was known as the #1 expert in Eastern Europe, was completely shattered. 4 streaks of sword light crisscrossed and directly cut Hustiel's body into 4 pieces. The blood of the mutilated body splashed in all directions. Li Tianlong didn't stop and continued to move forward. King Tong's whole body began to tremble violently. Another invincible realm expert died. 1 move. Insta-kill. For anyone, this was the most impactful picture. Under the sword light, even the invincible realm experts on the divine list were like non-entities. Who had ever seen such a picture? The dark world was in constant disputes, but compared to the current general trend, it had been calm for many years. King Tong had never seen an invincible realm expert killed in 1 move. Paul had never seen it. Charlemagne had never seen it either. They knew that Wang Tianzong could do it, but they had never seen it. It wasn't until this picture really appeared in front of them that the impact was fully reflected at once. It was extreme fear and despair. "We are willing to admit defeat," Paul suddenly said. He looked at Li Tianlong with cold eyes. "Rothschild will withdraw from Eastern Europe, which is good for everyone. Their ally had already fallen tonight. What was the point of staying here?" Li Tianlong still didn't stop. He kept moving forward, and he was less than 10 meters away from Paul. The space kept twisting as he walked. He fought with Wang Tianzong, killed Lagos, and killed Hustiel. The sword energy had weakened, but the sword intent was still perfect. "Don't move." A ray of dim yellow light suddenly enveloped Li Tianlong's body completely. The dim yellow color kept swimming around him. The dim light was changing slightly, and it was blurry. Li Tianlong stopped where he was, looked at Charlemagne, and narrowed his eyes. "Please calm down, Your Highness. How about sparing my life?" The muzzle of the Twilight of the Gods was pointed at Li Tianlong. Charlemagne looked at Li Tianlong seriously, and his tone was completely low and humble as he begged. Li Tianlong looked at him without speaking or moving forward. "I'm willing to kill King Tong for Your Highness. Tonight, you and I are allies. If Your Highness is willing to let me go, the Heroes Club will be Your Highness's ally forever from now on." Charlemagne spoke with sincerity. "Are you done?" Li Tianlong said blandly. Charlemagne froze for a moment, and his face was cloudy. "Give it to me." Li Tianlong reached out his hand. Charlemagne subconsciously grasped the Twilight of the Gods in his hand, and said with an extremely ugly face, "Your Highness, give it to me." Li Tianlong repeated his words. Deity's sword energy was deity after all. However, if he could obtain the Twilight of the Gods, especially when it was in a charged state, the significance of it was self-evident. Charlemagne took a step forward subconsciously. Paul narrowed his eyes, but did not move. Charlemagne took another step forward. Li Tianlong looked at him quietly, but did not move. "Today, the Heroes Club is willing to offer the Twilight of the Gods to Your Highness." Charlemagne came to Li Tianlong, lifted the Twilight of the Gods horizontally, and lowered his head. Li Tianlong reached out his hand. In an instant, Charlemagne's face suddenly became ferocious. His palm swept across the body of the Twilight of the Gods. Click! It seemed to be the sound of the bolt being pulled. The entire muzzle of the Twilight of the Gods suddenly lit up with a dim yellow light. Li Tianlong's palm was about to touch this murderous weapon. Charlemagne's muzzle had turned, and was aimed at Li Tianlong's chest. The distance between the two was so close. Less than 2 meters. The murderous weapon opened fire with all its might. Bang! There was a sudden roar between heaven and earth. On the gloomy battlefield, endless dim yellow light suddenly burst out. It was like the setting sun rising in the sky. Chapter 5:23. The sun was setting. Down meant that it was falling. But the dim yellow light that exploded all over the sky was rising and flying high into the sky. The boundless killing intent swept over like a raging wave. The light was blurred and flew higher and higher. Bang! Without the slightest hesitation, Charlemagne fired again. The 12 murderous weapons were extremely mysterious. Countless people in the dark world did not know how many shots the Twilight of the Gods could fire. People only remembered that the Twilight of the Gods had fired 3 times in a row a long time ago. In fact, this was also the limit of the Twilight of the Gods. This murderous weapon that could perfectly fit all forces could only fire 3 times at most once it stored energy. Charlemagne seriously injured Arcis with the explosion of the Devil Troop and Paul's attack. And the remaining 2 shots were used on Li Tianlan. The light was like a tide, swallowing Li Tianlan's figure in an instant. The yellow light was whistling, flowing, and rushing. It rushed forward and rolled back. Li Tianlan's position became the center of all the light. The light continued to cover his body. The light forward and the light backward entangled together and flew high into the sky, becoming round like the setting sun. Charlemagne could not see Li Tianlan in the light. However, his expression was extremely ugly, and his eyes were filled with undisguised doubt and fear. 2/3 of the power of the Twilight of the Gods had burst out incisively and vividly. Although it was 2/3 of the power, this murderous weapon had not been fired for too long. The longer the time to store energy naturally meant more power. The real power of the 2 consecutive shots was no less than that of other murderous weapons. But the Twilight of the Gods should not be like this. Because its light was rising. Rising meant that it was getting farther and farther away from Li Tianlan. Why was this happening? Charlemagne felt a little incredulous. The dim yellow light kept dancing in front of him and slowly rose. The light of the Twilight of the Gods seemed to condense in place after the initial outbreak. The destructive power was still there, but at this time it seemed to be suppressed by an invisible force and was frozen in the air. Charlemagne gritted his teeth. He raised the Twilight of the Gods. The huge gun body rippled with a dim yellow light. The light gradually grew and finally merged with Charlemagne's domain. This murderous weapon was called the Twilight of the Gods. Charlemagne's domain was also called the Twilight of the Gods. The front end of the domain merged into the yellow light in front of Li Tianlan, and at the same time, it also enveloped King Tong and Paul. King Tong and Paul looked at each other. Their shadow domains began to spread at the same time, and finally merged with the Twilight of the Gods. This was the domain of 2 experts who were extremely close to the peak of the invincible realm, and 1 expert who was close to the peak of the invincible realm. There were only a few confirmed experts at the peak of the invincible realm in the dark world. Wang Tianzong had surpassed the peak of the invincible realm. He used a sword. Deity of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital was at the peak of the invincible realm. He also used a sword. Lin Fengting was at the peak of the invincible realm, and also used a sword. The master of Samsara Palace hovered at the peak of the invincible realm, and still used a sword. The current situation of the dark world was the world of swords. Arcis didn't use a sword, but he also didn't need a domain. He was good at close combat. In the entire dark world, the strongest person who chose the path of domain after entering the invincible realm was Gu Xingyun, the god of war of Zhongzhou state. So now that Paul and the other 2 joined forces, such a domain could be said to be the strongest domain in the dark world. The dim yellow light was still dancing and wreaking havoc. Li Tianlan seemed to be locked by the murderous weapon, and did not move. This period of time was both short and long. But for experts of the invincible realm, it was enough for them to complete a real outbreak of all their strength. Without any reservation, the 2 shadows, which seemed to be solid and almost black, merged with Charlemagne's domain. The strange and heavy power kept surging in Charlemagne's domain. Charlemagne's eyes gradually lit up. His eyes were clear and bright. At this moment, King Tong and Paul lent their strength to him at the same time. Somehow, it seemed to be an illusion. He had broken through the threshold that he had always dreamed of. With a murderous weapon in his hand, He was at the peak of the invincible realm. This was the strongest moment of his life. Charlemagne was full of confidence. The power of the shadow and his own slowly surged in the domain, which was extremely vast. Li Tianlan still didn't move. If you had agreed to my conditions just now, how could you have ended up like this now? Charlemagne looked at Li Tianlan, and his tone was dignified and cold. Li Tianlan didn't respond, and he couldn't. Tonight is your fate. Charlemagne's tone was cold. The overwhelming power was almost boundless, and it kept spreading in his domain. Charlemagne raised his hand as if he were holding a world. This world began to merge with the dim light. Charlemagne walked into the light. The strongest domain in the dark world had completely merged with the murderous weapon. In the dim yellow sky, Charlemagne finally saw Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan gently raised his palm. There was a clear light in front of him. The clear light was like a sword, and it wrapped him up like a ball. All the light hit the ball of light. The surface of the ball of light rippled, and the ripples spread layer by layer. Every ripple was an incomparably perfect sword intent. The sword intent that spread out merged perfectly with the light of the twilight of the gods. The sword intent rose into the sky with the light, getting higher and higher. Li Tianlan closed his eyes. He was calm, and there was a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. Charlemagne suddenly felt extremely cold all over. He opened his eyes wide and froze for a while. Then he suddenly roared. "What are you doing?" His voice was full of surprise and anger. The moment he spoke, Paul's face changed, and he instinctively pulled King Tong back. Li Tianlan took a step forward and whispered, "Don't move." Charlemagne's face turned red and he didn't move. It was not that he didn't dare to move, but the moment he walked in, he really couldn't move at all. A faint but incomparably real sword intent filled every ray of the twilight of the gods. The moment he tried to combine his domain with the twilight of the gods, the sword intent had directly rushed into his domain, like the spring rain moistening the leaves. It was soft and slow, but there was no way to stop it or resist it. All the sword intent completely wrapped Charlemagne's body, which was extremely cold. The domain was enveloped by this seemingly gentle sword intent, silent and undetectable. Charlemagne's face was full of absurdity and disbelief. This sword strike was not earth-shattering, but it was truly all-encompassing. Everyone knew that Li Tianlan's sword intent was perfect. Everyone knew that Li Tianlan was the future chosen one. But no one had seen perfection, and no one had seen the chosen one. To what extent was the perfection of the chosen one? The domain was silently devoured by the sword intent. Li Tianlan took a step forward. Endless clear light danced around him like a dragon, and the power of the twilight of the gods continued to rise into the sky. Li Tianlan's expression was calm. But at this moment, the yellow light and the clear light were entangled. Standing in the center of the light, he was really shining like a god. Charlemagne's eyes were full of horror. Horror turned into despair. Despair turned into madness. "Ah, ah!" He roared like an injured beast. Wrapped by countless sword intents, the strength of his whole body burst out desperately. In the desperate situation, he forgot about the future and even forgot about life and death. The power that was very close to the peak of the invincible realm surged wildly, like a waterfall that flew straight down, and moved forward with indomitable will. Lightning flashed and thunder roared. Flames rose and ice condensed. Li Tianlan waved his hand like a sword. The clear light and the dim yellow light fluctuated at the same time. The light collided with Charlemagne's final outburst. At the last moment, Li Tianlan saw Charlemagne's eyes. These were the eyes of the president of the Heroes Club, who was deeply rooted in South America and was influential in the dark world. These were the eyes of the 6th place on the divine list in the dark world. His eyes were full of fear, with great regret and pleading, and there were faint tears in them. He was an absolute expert in the dark world. But in the general trend, he chose the wrong direction. Under the general trend, even the invincible realm was like an ant. An ant who made a mistake could only die. There was a loud roar between heaven and earth. Charlemagne's final outburst of power was driven to the sky by the clear light. The setting sun had already risen high in the sky. Shadow and dusk merged with the clear light. Charlemagne's burning flame seemed to be the most important opportunity, completely igniting the setting sun. The setting sun instantly became fiery red, like the scorching sun. It was like the sun at high noon. Li Tianlan's arm chopped over. Blood splashed everywhere. Charlemagne stood where he was. But his head flew high and was shone into pieces by the light of the scorching sun in the night sky. Li Tianlan's arm was like a sword, but his fingers moved lightly in the air with great agility. It was like making a seal. The expression of deity, who had been standing beside Li Tianlan, changed slightly. He recognized Li Tianlan's seal. This was the Heartless Seal and the Divine Punishment Seal in the Immortality Seal. But the unique skill that belonged to the Purgatory of Heaven capital was completely restored to its essence in Li Tianlan's hands. The essence of the Immortality Seal was a sword. It was the 24 moves of sword. The Heartless Seal. The Divine Punishment Seal. It was the 8th blade and the 9th blade. The 8th blade, burning sky. The 9th blade, dusk. Deity looked at Li Tianlan deeply. The Immortality Seal was his unique skill. But at this moment, it was difficult for even him to do what Li Tianlan had done. And he couldn't do it at all. The light but extremely pure sword intent rushed directly to the sky with Li Tianlan's seal. The scorching sun high in the sky kept shaking and shaking. The light trembled in the air. The world was silent. Under everyone's desperate gaze, the scorching sun that occupied the night sky suddenly exploded. The sky was full of flowing fire. Li Tianlan stretched out his palm and suddenly clenched it. The Immortality Seal, all paths of nature. The exploding scorching sun turned into thousands of rays of light. The rays of light were scorching and low, covering down like a sea. Each ray of light was a sword. This sword completely covered the entire battlefield. The falling light fell on the crowd. It bypassed the Snowdance Corps, the Dark Knights, the Terracotta Army and the Devil Troop. Countless rays of light passed through the Vatican, Rothschild, the Eastern Church, and the chests and glabella of the elites of Morton and the Violet family. Li Tianlan closed his eyes. His world was full of sword light. Every ray of sword light was his sword. The light was scorching, and there was silence. In the absolute silence, there was only death. Countless elites fell down one after another. They opened their mouths to shout, but they could not make any sound. The battlefield became quieter and quieter. It was hopelessly quiet. In the hazy sword intent, Li Tianlan opened his eyes. Paul and King Tong, whose faces were extremely pale, found that even if the sword light disappeared, the whole battlefield was also quiet. The elites of the Snowdance Corps, the Terracotta Army, and the Dark Knights stood where they were in a daze. And in front of them, there were no more opponents. Not a single one. Li Tianlan's face was slightly pale, and his aura gradually weakened. But he was still indifferent. He glanced at Paul and King Tong and said what Paul had once said. Now we can have a good time. There were still 5 more heavenly suns, and it would be over after 5. Chapter 524. The calmness on Paul's face had completely disappeared, leaving only solemnity. There was dead silence on the battlefield. Death and blood were sprinkled in every inch of the surrounding space. They were everywhere. They were all dead. With the energy of the twilight of the gods as the foundation, the setting sun rose and turned into a scorching sun. Under Li Tianlan's complete outburst, the domains of the 3 of them were twisted into sword intent. That was Li Tianlan's own sword intent. It was also the sword intent that was twisted by the domains of Paul, King Tong, and Charlemagne. Such sword intent did not seem very powerful to them, but it was truly as majestic as the sea. Tens of thousands of sword intents turned into sword energy and swept across the battlefield. The elites of Rothschild were all wiped out. The elites of the Eastern Church, the Violet family, and the Morton family were all wiped out. The elites of the Heroes Club were all wiped out. There were no exceptions. Charlemagne himself was beheaded. It began to rain again in the dead space. Paul's body suddenly shivered, and his face turned pale. Even the people of the Snowdance Corps couldn't believe all this. They were all stunned on the spot. No one could describe what it felt like. The extreme fear turned into unparalleled coldness, which seemed to freeze everyone's heart and will. Paul subconsciously looked around Li Tianlan. There was no one around him, but he was sure that someone was standing here. It was just that he couldn't see it. Did you see it? Paul suddenly said. His eyes swept across the void around Li Tianlan. Even if you do it yourself, you can't do it. He suddenly pointed at Li Tianlan. If he really grows up 10 years later, no one will be able to control him. If you support him now, maybe he will kill you then. With that sword strike just now, he even killed the people of the Vatican. Don't you understand? He only has himself in his heart. He has no allies, and he doesn't need allies. There was silence all around. Only Paul's trembling voice could be heard. His voice trembled slightly with panic, but what he said was the truth. Countless elites of the major forces were destroyed with that sword strike. The sword light was like fire. The sky was full of flowing fire. However, the sword intent was extremely cold, cruel, and cold-blooded. That was the real ruthless sword. It was a ruthless sword. No one in the dark world could do that. That sword strike was so ruthless, but it was also so perfect. No one around Li Tianlan could do this. Wang Tianzong couldn't do it either. Only Li Tianlan could do it. Now Li Tianlan had the sword energy of the peak of the invincible realm. In other words, the stronger he was today, the stronger he would be when he entered the peak of the invincible realm in the future. In terms of combat capability, Wang Tianzong might be slightly better than him now. But that sword just now represented absolute delicacy beneath the incomparably majestic. It was flawless. No one wanted to see Li Tianlan like this. Because no one wanted to see a prodigy. That meant absolute invincibility, absolute dominance, and sole will. Behind the glory of the chosen one was the darkness of the whole dark world. Just thinking about it was enough to make one feel terrified. Paul's breathing was a little hurried. He really hoped to get some response. Because this was his last chance to make a comeback. The first thing Li Tianlan did when he stood up was to fight with Wang Tianzong. That sword might have many meanings. But to Paul, the most important thing was the sword itself. That sword move was earth-shattering, clearly declaring Li Tianlan's position at the absolute peak of the dark world at this time. His strength was fully demonstrated. Wang Tianzong was not afraid of this sword move, but he would not come again. Only when the peak of the invincible realm standing next to Li Tianlan at this time gave up supporting Li Tianlan could the situation tonight be reversed. But there was only silence around. There was no sound to respond to Paul. Paul's eyes gradually became a little desperate. Bang! Charlemagne's headless body, the corpse, stood stiff in place for a while, and finally fell down. Blood spilled. Li Tianlan waved his hand. The sword intent swept over. The body of the president of the Heroes Club, who ranked 6th on the divine list, began to become loose, and then gradually shattered. Under the fine sword intent, his body dissolved rapidly and turned into dust all over the sky. The twilight of the gods fell to the ground. A fist-sized eyeball-like thing also appeared in front of Li Tianlan. Holy punishment of void. Li Tianlan clenched his palm. The two murderous weapons that had lost their vitality fell into his hands and turned into 2 rings. There were 12 murderous weapons in the dark world now. There were 5 of them on him alone. Blue sky underworld, falling stars, twilight of the gods, holy punishment of void, and dark saint spear. But none of them could fire. Li Tianlan's eyes fell on Paul. The invisible sword intent all over the sky shook with a bang. At this moment, Paul completely gave up all hope. He suddenly pulled King Tong's palm and said in a low voice, "Let's go." He was no match for Li Tianlan, so he could only admit his failure tonight. He didn't even have time to feel sorry for the loss tonight. In the current situation, it was good to be able to run away. But could they really run away? The brother and sister turned around and flew back. The moment they turned around, King Tong clearly saw the determination in Paul's eyes. The sword intent drifted in the night sky like rain. King Tong suddenly broke free from Paul's palm. She didn't speak. A shadow as thick as ink spread out from around her in an instant. The dark shadow had almost condensed into a substance. The domain that had condensed into a substance hit Paul's, turning back hard. Paul was completely unprepared. In the huge impact, he only had time to roar, and the next second he was directly knocked out. She didn't hit Li Tianlan. King Tong pushed Paul far away in the blink of an eye. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and looked at King Tong. King Tong's body was trembling slightly. Her eyes were filled with tears. She was a little scared and pitiful. In the whole of Europe, she was the queen of the Shadow Throne. She was decisive and always kept her word. But in the Rothschild family, she was the unruly and willful younger sister, who had almost never let her brother worry about her all her life. Tonight, because of her, Paul was also in a desperate situation. King Tong was very afraid of death. But she didn't want Paul to die even more. So she pushed Paul out. She stayed by herself. The powerful aura surged wildly in her body. An endless power poured into her domain. Vaguely, King Tong was bleeding all over, and her body seemed to have swelled up. No, Paul's hoarse voice rang out in the distance. Stop. King Tong stared at Li Tianlan. She could no longer hear other sounds. All around her were the roars caused by the huge power. The expanding power began to shrink to the limit. At this moment, even Li Tianlan felt a hint of danger. He raised his eyebrows and stretched out a hand. He moved like a sword. Boom. With a slight but extremely clear roar, the rain accumulated on the ground all left the ground and rushed into the sky as Li Tianlan moved. The rain flew like swords. In an instant there was rain all around King Tong. The rain rose from the ground and fell from the sky. Every drop of rain flashed with sword light, which was as awe-inspiring as a sword. King Tong was still compressing her domain to the limit. Layers of sword rain fell on the surface of the domain. Crack! The space was torn apart. Cracks appeared one after another in the ink-like domain. Li Tianlan stepped forward. The rain from up to down kept hitting King Tong's domain. The domain was no longer shrinking, but it kept trembling. King Tong gritted her teeth and stared at Li Tianlan's eyes. Li Tianlan was expressionless and stretched out his hand again. The rain in the sky and on the ground converged at the same time. Bang! In the violent sound, King Tong's domain completely lost control and exploded. The terrifying destructive power set off waves of air visible to the naked eye and spread in all directions. Li Tianlan seemed to be unaware of it. He stretched out his palm and slapped it directly on the top of her head. The wind and rain suddenly became chaotic. The sword intent went to the domain and disappeared silently in an instant. Paul's furious and almost irrational roar came over. A red mist rose around King Tong. The mist was soon swallowed up by the messy wind and rain. King Tong's figure was frozen in place, motionless. Li Tianlan withdrew his hand. A series of sounds came from inside her body. A faint and indifferent sword intent kept raging in her body, tearing every piece of her muscle and destroying every piece of her bone. It was extremely quiet all around. The sharp pain spread inside her body. King Tong could even feel that her bones were cracking, which was miserable and horrible. The last trace of blood turned into a red mist and disappeared from her sight. She didn't die. But all her martial arts, what she had learned all her life, and all her power disappeared with the disappearance of this red mist. There was no possibility of recovery in this life. King Tong was still alive. But the Queen of Shadows in the dark world had completely died in this red mist. King Tong's eyes were desperate and desolate, without even pain. Li Tianlan took a look at her, and watched her fall in front of him. He didn't know what he was thinking of, but he suddenly felt a little tired, and was not in the mood to play. A scarlet and strange saber light came from the front. The shadow gathered on the saber light, which was strange and cold. The saber light, which was hundreds of feet long, tore the space apart, and its killing intent was almost crazy. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes, and suddenly reached out to grab at the void. The extremely messy wind and rain suddenly gathered toward his palm. In an instant, it seemed that the rain curtain within a radius of thousands of meters was pulled over by him. The storm was blooming in his hand. The water splashed like a sword. It was extremely fierce. Except for the time when he fought with Wang Tianzong, it was the first time that Li Tianlan had a sword in his hand. It was a sword condensed by the heavy rain all over the sky. The red saber light that tore the sky came over. Li Tianlan held the sword with one hand and slashed over. There was no sword intent or sword light in the night, only a faint and cold wind and rain. The wind and rain seemed to flash through the space, and appeared in front of the red saber light in an instant. Clang! The saber light didn't break the wind and rain. At the moment when the two sides collided, the whole world roared. The huge saber light suddenly broke into two pieces. The saber light was broken. The famous European saber, Ghost Hand, was also cut into two pieces. The faint and cold sword intent whistled past, and disappeared without a trace. Paul, who seemed to have not suffered any injury, froze in the air for a moment. His whole body was completely out of balance, and he fell directly to the ground. His face was as pale as paper. He opened his mouth, but strangely he couldn't make any sound. In the blink of an eye, his face was covered with sweat. There was a slight sound of footsteps. Li Tianlan walked over slowly. King Tong lay on the ground with a dull face. Paul's face was covered with cold sweat, and his whole body was trembling. Li Tianlan looked down at the pair of invincible realm experts of Rothschild. His Majesty Sword Emperor said that I can't kill you too. That's his bottom line. Li Tianlan looked at Paul and said with a very serious face, I'm very afraid of him. Paul looked at Li Tianlan and said nothing. But if I let you go like this, won't I lose face? He looked at Paul for a long time and then whispered, How about you do me a favor? I was going to update 2 chapters today to make up for yesterday's. This time is not good enough. Can I update 2 chapters tomorrow? Besides, my leave slips are all posted in the relevant section of my works. Apex. Chapter 525. For anyone, life was the greatest wealth, better than any interest. Paul had to give Li Tianlan face. It was a matter of life and death. Therefore he had to give him face. He was not afraid of too much, but not enough. Under the wind and rain, Li Tianlan was surrounded by clear light. The clear light surrounded him and Paul with a hazy sword intent. In other words, the space where the two of them were was completely cut off by Li Tianlan in an instant and became a new world. No one could hear their conversation. Sure enough, Paul felt the changes in the surrounding space, and his pale face became paler. He muttered to himself. The sword fight with Wang Tianzong was earth-shattering. He killed Charlemagne and Lagos with a wave of his hand. He fought against the murderous weapon. He destroyed King Tong. A gust of wind and rain cut off the ghost hand. Li Tianlan had completely shown his strength, which made all his enemies desperate. But only at this moment did Paul really feel what despair was. This hazy sword intent isolated the entire space, as if it had completely lost contact with heaven and earth. Reality and illusion. Light and darkness. All of them were in one sword strike. This was sword intent and also a domain. Under the cover of this sword intent, Paul couldn't even exert the power of an ordinary person. What was the chosen one? What was absolute dominance? Everything in front of him seemed to have taken shape. The sword intent at present didn't seem to be perfect, but it was not because the sword intent was imperfect, but because the level of the sword intent was still a little low. All of Paul's speculations became facts. No matter who secretly lent his sword energy to Li Tianlan, this kind of sword energy at the peak of the invincible realm was far more powerful in Li Tianlan's hands than in his own hands. His sword intent was truly flawless. In other words, if there was a chosen one by Li Tianlan's side tonight, Li Tianlan's combat capability would be exactly the same as that of a real chosen one, because his sword intent was really perfect. Paul looked at Li Tianlan. This was what no one wanted to see Li Tianlan. He was surrounded by clear light, which was extremely bright and beautiful. But in his eyes, Paul saw endless darkness. That's it. Li Tianlan nodded, looked at Paul, and then at King Tong, and asked, How much is your life worth? Deity had been standing by Li Tianlan's side. The hazy sword intent covered Paul and Li Tianlan. Everything about the two of them disappeared from his perception. Deity narrowed his eyes and said nothing. The battlefield not far away finally began to move. There were no enemies in the Snowdance Corps. They began to gather and sort out the bodies of their comrades who had died. The elites of the Dark Knights were doing the same thing. The 4 spirits of Zhongzhou State came together. At the most critical time, they temporarily helped the Snowdance Corps, and the Dark Knights withstand the pressure, and even controlled the Devil Troop. Gong Sun Chi, the leader of the 4 spirits, slowly walked over. Deity remained calm and turned to look in the direction of the office of the president. Between the battlefield and the office of the president, there was a faint, almost imperceptible sword light that flashed for a moment. Tonight's matter was over. But Deity knew that the chaos in Eastern Europe was not over. Because of the President Palace's silence. Because of the sword light that flashed by just now. It was also because he was still standing here tonight. Deity stood quietly, thinking about the situation after tonight. When the chaos in Eastern Europe broke out, no one could have imagined that the situation would reach this point. The war continued, and blood flowed like a river. The divine and holy lists were already in tatters. All the major forces were leaderless. Zhongzhou state also paid a heavy price. But after tonight, the advantage of the Snowdance Corps would completely turn into a victory. With Wulon state as the center, Zhongzhou state would encroach on the entire Zhongzhou state step by step. In 10 years or 20 years, all of Eastern Europe would fall into the hands of Zhongzhou state. This sounded like a long time. But at that time, all of Eastern Europe would become a sort of Zhongzhou state pointing at Europe, or even a sort of Zhongzhou state conquering the world. This was a real achievement for 1,000 years. Deity suddenly thought of a sentence. In the dark world in the next 100 years, there are 3 words that are destined to be called great. Zhongzhou state, East Emperor Palace. Li Tianlan. This sentence spread throughout the dark world not long ago. That was after Li Tianlan won the maneuver of the 2 academies of Zhongzhou state. On that day he stood in the Sky Academy and shattered the whole era alone. The future era. 10 or 20 years later, when Eastern Europe completely fell into the hands of Zhongzhou state, it would be Li Tianlan's peak period. Zhongzhou state could not do nothing. Li Tianlan could not do nothing. Compared with today, that might be a real feast. Deity did not want to miss the feast in the future. So he appeared in Eastern Europe and appeared here tonight. The faint sword intent slowly flowed around him. Li Tianlan and Paul, who had disappeared from his perception, gradually appeared. Only then did Deity realize that he had been in a trance for a long time. He came to his senses and glanced at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan was looking at Paul. Paul helped King Tong, who was lying on the ground in a daze, up and carried her on his back. He took a deep look at Li Tianlan, turned around, and left, staggering. Li Tianlan and Deity looked at the back of the brother and sister, and did not speak for a long time. Marshal Li. Gong Sunqi's voice sounded beside Li Tianlan, and he sounded a little tired. Li Tianlan replied with a hmm. Deity also replied with a hmm. Then he seemed to realize something, laughed at himself, and shook his head. Li Tianlan shook hands with Gong Sunqi and said calmly, "Thank you, General." Gong Sunqi shook his head, and was silent for a while. Suddenly he said, "I just did what a Zhongzhou state person should do." His tone was calm. But under the surface of calmness, Li Tianlan seemed to see a storm. A red gaze appeared in his field of vision. Li Tianlan turned his head and looked over. The devil troop surrounded by the terracotta army was also looking at him. Li Tianlan was expressionless. "What do you want to do with these people?" Gong Sunqi suddenly asked. The devil troop had always been an extremely mysterious force of the Wang family of Beihai. Some of them were even the invincible realm experts of the Wang family of Beihai hundreds of years ago. It was impossible to verify their identities over the long years. Perhaps everyone knew that they belonged to the devil troop of Beihai, but they could not produce any evidence. After these people left Beihai, they had nothing to do with the whole world. That was what they said. But tonight, Li Tianlan was the winner. With the remaining power of the great victory, he had a clear guess. The Snowdance Corps might be able to make big trouble for the Wang family of Beihai. At least the 4 spirits of Zhongzhou state, who were absolutely neutral, would definitely stand on Li Tianlan's side. This was not a position, but their own attitude. Devils of Beihai. They might have been heroes of the Wang family of Beihai, but their performance tonight had already explained one thing. For Zhongzhou state, their existence was meaningless. Gong Sunqi would not let them go. Because many people died in the hands of the devil troop tonight, not only the soldiers of the Snowdance Corps, but also the soldiers of Zhongzhou state. Li Tianlan thought about it, shook his head, and said, "Kill them." Gong Sunqi frowned and looked at Li Tianlan in silence. "They can't hold on any longer," Li Tianlan said. Gong Sun-chi took the initiative to mention this topic, not to help Li Tianlan, but because he needed Li Tianlan's support. The neutral party was still weak in Zhongzhou state. But Li Tianlan represented the academics and the giant group. If he could get Li Tianlan's support, Gong Sun-chi could vent his anger on the Wang family of Beihai. However, Li Tianlan also knew very well that they didn't have much time since the devil came out. At least, there was no time for Gong Sun-chi to collect evidence. Without evidence, what was the point of some accusations to the Wang family of Beihai? Gong Sun-chi clenched his fists and said nothing. "General, take my army back to the office of the president to fix it temporarily," Li Tianlan said calmly. "You're not going back?" Gong Sun-chi raised his eyebrows. "I have something to do." Li Tianlan didn't say much. Gong Sun-chi nodded and turned to leave. Li Tianlan looked at his back, and then at the crowd in the distance. The sight of the devil troop was still emitting red light. But there were only 2 devils left. There were 12 people in the devil troop at the beginning. There were 6 people left in the war tonight. 4 people died. 2 were here. Where did the other 2 go? Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. In the dull and neat footsteps, the Snowdance Corps left the battlefield in silence. Li Tianlan stood where he was until they were completely far away. Then he turned around and sat on a nearby broken stone, saying, "Thank you." Deity's figure appeared in front of him little by little. He threw Li Tianlan a cigarette and didn't speak. Li Tianlan lit the cigarette and took a deep breath. He suddenly coughed. The clear light around him kept shaking and breaking little by little. His aura was completely weak. Deity looked at Li Tianlan with playful eyes. Li Tianlan finished smoking a cigarette, threw away the cigarette butt, and looked at Deity. The 2 looked at each other for a long time. Li Tianlan took the initiative to say, "You won't kill me?" "Why should I kill you?" Deity laughed. "I don't know." Li Tianlan was silent for a while. "But I can feel your killing intent. When I took action just now, you wanted to kill me several times." He looked at the rain in front of him. His voice and eyes were extremely light. "I have a question," he suddenly said. "Don't ask." Deity shook his head. "You need to thank me, and I need to thank you," Deity said calmly. "I saw your sword. Your sword is very strong." He bowed slightly to Li Tianlan and said quietly, "The strongest. So thank you." Li Tianlan's sword energy belonged to Deity, but his sword intent belonged to him. The most perfect sword intent controlled the sword energy at the peak of the invincible realm. At that moment, Li Tianlan had completely surpassed Deity in terms of combat capability. This also let Deity see his future. The road ahead still couldn't reach the end, but it could also make him take a small step forward. Although he couldn't reach it, he yearned for it. He was not far from the end. It was good to take one more step, even half a step. Li Tianlan didn't speak for a long time. He suddenly didn't know what to say. He just wanted to ask if the man in front of him was his father. Deity didn't let him ask. But his attitude had explained everything. If they were really father and son, even if they had never met, even if they were unfamiliar with each other, even if he was better than his father, he would not bow. There was no need. Li Tianlan's face was a little pale. The wind and rain fell, and wet his whole body. His eyes were dim and he looked a little pitiful. Anyway, he quietly thought about the scenes tonight. "I still want to thank you." Deity's tone was completely calm and restored to its original indifference. "I said no matter what, Eastern Europe belongs to the Li family. No matter whose Li family it is, it's not up to outsiders to intervene." Li Tianlan withdrew his gaze from the distance and narrowed his eyes at Deity. His eyes were deep, but there was a hidden sharpness in them. "Of course it's my Li family, my Eastern Europe." There seemed to be a cold shadow in Deity's eyes. He glanced at Li Tianlan. After a long time he said coldly, "So what if I give it to you for the time being?" "You don't care?" "When have I ever cared?" "If you don't care, what are you doing in Eastern Europe?" Deity glanced at Li Tianlan with cold eyes. "What am I doing in Eastern Europe? You should ask your woman." Li Tianlan froze for a moment. He had 3 women now, but only Qin Weibai was qualified to stand at the same height as Deity. Li Tianlan's face became solemn and he said seriously, "What do you mean?" More than 3 years ago, she said that she wanted the Wang family of Beihai to fall into hell forever. That's why the purgatory of heaven capital appeared in East Island. That's why I'm in Eastern Europe now. Deity cooperated with many people. He cooperated with Qin Weibai. He also cooperated with the mysterious majesty. The cooperation between the two seemed to be in conflict, but it was not. He wanted Qin Weibai to die. But that was after Qin Weibai completed the cooperation with him. Li Tianlan finally understood something. So the purgatory of heaven capital came to Eastern Europe, this time not for Eastern Europe, but for Beihai? He asked slowly. Of course. Deity's tone was calm. As long as I'm here, Wang Tianzong won't leave. So what ends tonight is the chaos. After dawn, the grievances begin. Just solve them together. Wang Tianzong is not a fool. Li Tianlan said seriously. It has nothing to do with being stupid or not. Deity's eyes were in a trance. He's a man. Every man has something he has to do and doesn't want to consider the consequences. Weren't you helping me when you fought with him just now? Deity suddenly laughed. Li Tianlan's pupils contracted slightly. He didn't expect that Deity would see the deep meaning of that sword. In this way he really saw his future. Li Tianlan stood up, deep in thought. Deity and Qin Weibai still cooperated. But if this cooperation was successful, after the Wang family of Beihai fell, what would happen between the Samsara Palace and the purgatory of heaven capital? It could only be a bloody storm. It could only be a sword light. Once again Li Tianlan felt tired. He looked at the drizzling night. After a long time he asked softly, "We will be enemies, right?" Deity was also looking into the distance and whispered, "Who knows?" Li Tianlan stopped talking and was lost in thought. "Are you lonely?" Deity seemed to see Li Tianlan's heart and asked aloud. Only the invincible realm would be lonely. So Li Tianlan shook his head. "No." He paused and continued. "It's just a little lonely." Deity was silent for a while. He reached out and patted him on the shoulder without saying anything. Chapter 526. The sword-like clear light slowly disappeared around Li Tianlan. The peak combat capability began to decline. Li Tianlan was surrounded by severe pain and weakness once again. He sat on the broken stone, his mind blank, his body relaxed, and he didn't speak for a long time. He seemed to have thought of a lot, but also seemed to have thought of nothing. The sword energy dissipated. The sword intent still existed. He sat there, and the whole night sky seemed to become extremely quiet with his figure. Deity's palm was taken back. The sword energy lent to Li Tianlan was also taken back. The sword energy was extremely pure. It was like Deity's hand on Li Tianlan's shoulder. There was no hostility, no killing intent, and no intimacy. Only pure. Li Tianlan lowered his head. In desperation, Deity said that Eastern Europe belonged to the Li family no matter what. From another point of view, he was naturally a member of the Li family. He was not his father. Then who was he? Who was he? I'm sure of one thing. Li Tianlan lowered his head and didn't raise it. His tone was very calm. I don't know who you are. I don't even know who I am. But it doesn't matter. His voice was soft and seemed to be smiling. What matters is that this is my Li family. Deity seemed to smile. It was an emotionless, pure smile. Li Tianlan said calmly, "So if you want to kill me, tonight is the best chance, and maybe even the last chance." Deity glanced at Li Tianlan and didn't speak. He just sat there quietly motionless. All the light was behind him, and his figure looked a little dim. It was not loneliness. It was loneliness and boredom. Deity sighed softly. It began to be silent. After a long time, Li Tianlan raised his head. Deity's figure had disappeared in front of him, silently, without any answer. An incomparably gorgeous sword light flashed across the night sky. The sword light was bright and sharp. The wind and rain retreated with the sword light, with a touch of delicate fragrance. Dongqing Rushi appeared in front of Li Tianlan. Looking at the scene in front of her, she was obviously stunned. Li Tianlan smiled. Dongqing Rushi's change was too obvious. The determination of the sword light and her blankness at this time blended together, making her look a little dazed. "It's over," he said softly. Dongqing Rushi let out an ah and said blankly, Some died, some ran away." Li Tianlan looked at the mess in front of him. After a while he continued to say, "We won." Dongqing Rushi looked at Li Tianlan. Her eyes were as clear as water, with undisguised admiration. This was the most intoxicating charm. She walked to Li Tianlan's side and sat down. The silent sword was beside her. She leaned into Li Tianlan's arms and asked softly, "Are you okay?" Li Tianlan shook his head. His current injuries were naturally very serious, but his body was undamaged, and the dragon vein he carried was extremely stable. He only needed a few days of rest to recover to his peak state again. This was a fact that would undoubtedly strike fear into the hearts of all enemies. This also meant that in the battle with Li Tianlan, as long as he could not be killed, it was meaningless to inflict serious injuries on him. "My sister went back to Zhongzhou State. She said she would get the sword for you," Dongqing Rushi said softly. Li Tianlan nodded. Before fighting with Wang Tianzong, even before deity appeared, he had already heard the roar of the Snowdance Corps. He was sure that there was no one in the office of the president at that time. That was why that sword strike was so earth-shattering. Now Dongqing Rushi was here, but Qin Weibai was not. Obviously she had left. "Tianlan." Dongqing Rushi leaned against him and shouted. Li Tianlan glanced at her. "You're amazing." Dongqing Rushi blinked her clear eyes and said seriously. Li Tianlan looked down at her. The two of them were no longer new acquaintances. But this was the first time Li Tianlan stared at Dongqing Rushi's face. She was undoubtedly extremely beautiful, even extremely beautiful. Different from Qin Weibai's dreamlike delicacy, her face looked a little enchanting, and there was a touch of softness and charm at the corners of her eyes and the tips of her eyebrows. But her temperament was extremely clear, and the enchanting perfectly combined in her. She was pure, fresh, sexy, soft, and well-behaved. Dongqing Rushi's every move was the most moving scenery. Li Tianlan looked down at her red lips, which were as delicate and moist as rose petals, and subconsciously lowered his head. Dongqing Rushi opened her eyes wide, and her clear eyes were full of innocence. Li Tianlan raised his head a little awkwardly. Dongqing Rushi reached out and held his face. Her face became softer, and the charm at the corners of her eyes and the tips of her eyebrows became more obvious. The cold midsummer in Eastern Europe seemed to have entered the deep winter. Dongqing Rushi stared at Li Tianlan's face seriously. Her voice was a little soft, trembling, sweet, and even a little coquettish. "Come on." Li Tianlan slowly lowered his head. His body was completely relaxed, as if he had relaxed after a big battle. Dongqing Rushi gently put her arms around Li Tianlan's neck and closed her eyes. The corners of Li Tianlan's lips finally touched the cool fragrance, which was extremely tender. Time seemed to freeze at this second, until Li Tianlan's uncontrollable breathing sounded. Dongqing Rushi grabbed his hair. Li Tianlan, who was a little confused, raised his head, and his eyes were a little confused. He knew that there was something wrong with his current state. But when the sword energy dissipated, he really didn't intend to think about anything. The great boredom in his heart devoured his will. He didn't know where the boredom came from, but he had no interest in everything tonight. Dongqing Rushi's soft lips seemed to ignite a fire in his heart. The fire was burning, and it seemed that it couldn't wait to break out of his body. "Do you want it?" Dongqing Rushi buried her head in Li Tianlan's arms. Li Tianlan replied hoarsely. He put his hand into her pants. Who would believe him if he said he didn't want it? "I don't want it here," Dongqing Rushi whispered. Li Tianlan replied again. He forced himself to calm down, but when he pulled out his palm, he couldn't help but pinch the softness that seemed to be under a piece of gauze. Dongqing Rushi's delicate body trembled slightly. She bit her lip, feeling a little resentful. The rumbling footsteps resounded throughout the city. Tens of thousands of elites of the Snowdance Corps gradually approached the battlefield. There was no light on the battlefield, no fighting. It was quiet, only wind and rain. Li Tianlan stood up. It was not until this moment that he was really sure that he was the only one left in the entire Wulan state, and even in the 5 countries of Eastern Europe. Supremacy. He looked up at the sky. At this moment, the eyes of the entire dark world were focused on Reki City. But the general trend of the dark world had already swept everything. The divine and holy lists were fragmented. The dark world fell apart. What was the point of having so many eyes at this time? Chapter 527. The sky of Yuzhou was officially shrouded in darkness. The wind and rain were still messy. However, the extremely tense atmosphere in Yuzhou gradually calmed down in the heavy rain. The hidden dragon sea was quiet. However, the Dragon Diagram Park, whose political status was second only to the hidden dragon sea in Zhongzhou State, was completely silent. When the nearly endless artillery and armed police rushed into the mountain road of the Dragon Diagram Park with armored vehicles, the entire Dragon Diagram Park seemed to be completely silent in an instant. The Dragon Diagram Park was not open to the public. It used to be a vast royal garden. Since the founding of Zhongzhou State, it had always been the place where the members of the decision-making committee of Zhongzhou State lived and recuperated. There were about 30 single-family villas in the Dragon Diagram Park. In front of each villa, there was a separate mountain road. On weekdays there were armed police guarding them, and they were heavily guarded. In the heavy rain, the goal of the army that rushed into the Dragon Diagram Garden could be said to be extremely clear. They chose a mountain road close to the center and went straight up the mountain. At the last moment, they were less than 200 meters away from the single-family villa in front of them. This mountain road led to the 6th building of the Dragon Diagram Park. Yi Dongsheng, one of the leaders of the southeast group of Zhongzhou State, a member of the decision-making committee, the deputy minister of the army headquarters, the chief of general staff and the minister of military intelligence, and known as the god of army of Zhongzhou State, lived in the 6th building. This was just a corner of the vast Yuzhou. The boundless army was like a vast and mighty shadow, covering all the key positions and special places of Yuzhou. In the gradually calming atmosphere, the entire Yuzhou seemed to be silent. All the people were waiting for the end of tonight in fear. No one even knew what was going on. The armed police and artillery stopped less than 200 meters away from the Dragon Diagram Park. The main battle tank that was rolling the road at the front opened, and a general with a major general epaulet came out. He was burly, fierce, and had a cold face. Through the wind and rain, 200 meters away, he could already clearly see the lights in the 6th building of the Dragon Diagram Park. The general stood at the front of the crowd, looking at the lights in the distance in silence. No one knew what he was thinking. He was the youngest deputy commander of the Zhongzhou State Garrison Corps. Born in the Border Praetorian Corps, he could be said to be a high-profile young man in the army. In tonight's action, he was also the highest commander in the area of the Dragon Diagram Park. The wind and rain were fierce, but he had received the order to withdraw. Military orders must be obeyed. The heavy order firmly suppressed the burning, restless, and even somewhat crazy hot blood in his body. He looked at the 6th building in front of him, and was silent for a long time. The lights in the 6th building were still bright. Standing there, the pressure of the entire Dragon Diagram Park seemed to be pressing down on him, turning into an indescribable feeling. It was a mixture of anger, power, and indifference, like a storm. The Major General's body swayed. In this storm, he could clearly feel that something was moving away from him. For example, status, future, and freedom in the future. The most important thing was life. He silently turned around. After a long time he slowly said, "Pass down the order, withdraw the troops." The Longtu Park was withdrawing its troops. Troops in all corners of Yuzhou province were also retreating. On the sea in the night, countless warships also began to slowly turn around. The pressure that shrouded the entire Yuzhou province began to gradually disappear. As the army retreated, Yuzhou City seemed to recover its vigor under the heavy rain. Hidden Dragon Sea, Golden Autumn Pavilion Study Room. The huge screen had been divided into countless smaller screens. The picture belonging to Eastern Europe was played on a larger screen. On the countless smaller screens, there were pictures of all corners of Yuzhou and the sea. The screen of Eastern Europe was full of troops. The streets and alleys of Yuzhou were also full of troops. All the troops were retreating. Summer Solstice watched this scene quietly. and her tense body finally relaxed. That night in this study room, she completely saw the madness of the Dongqing clan, but she obviously didn't want to accompany the madness of the Dongqing clan. So she called Wang Tianzong. Although Wang Tianzong didn't make a move, what Li Tianlan did next had turned the situation around. It didn't matter why he was so powerful. What mattered was that he not only didn't die, but also won the final victory. After the battle, the divine list was fragmented. 2 of the 4 major families in Eastern Europe were destroyed, and the remaining 2 were also allies of Li Tianlan. Within 10 years, all of Eastern Europe would become the territory of Zhongzhou state. The Wang family of Beihai didn't want to see this result, but at least it avoided a life-and-death struggle with the Dongqing clan. So now Summer Solstice's mood was extremely complicated. She couldn't imagine what Dongqing Wudi would do if Li Tianlan died in Eastern Europe. The god of massacre of Zhongzhou state was straightforward and decisive. If Li Tianlan died, Summer Solstice could be sure that tonight, Yuzhou City would usher in the largest and most far-reaching mutiny since the founding of the People's Republic. Dongqing Wudi's anger would completely engulf all the high-level officials of the Southeast Group who were biased to the Wang family of Beihai and were still in Yuzhou City. The Beihai Corps would also usher in a war that was destined to win but extremely tragic. It wouldn't take long. It would only take one night. After one night, the Dongqing clan would completely fall apart, and Dongqing Wudi wouldn't even walk out of this study alive. The giant group would be destroyed. But the Southeast Group would also change from the most powerful group in Zhongzhou state to the weakest group. The Beihai Corps stationed in Beihai would suffer heavy losses. In the chaos, no one would let go of Beihai or the Southeast Group. Their living space would be constantly compressed. Zhongzhou state would even take over the entire Beihai Corps. Once the military power changed hands, the political power naturally couldn't exist for a long time. At that time, maybe Mount Dibing would really become a mountain in Zhongzhou state, and there would be nothing special about it. In this way, the Wang family of Beihai might still be extremely powerful. But when the foundation was completely shaken or even dismantled, no matter how powerful the Wang family was, how long could they be free and unfettered? Summer Solstice couldn't help but take another look at Dongqing Wudi. Dongqing Wudi had completely calmed down. Looking at Summer Solstice's eyes, he nodded slightly, as if nothing had happened before. Well done. Li Huaqing's voice finally sounded in the study after a long silence. His voice was hearty and full of passion. After this war, the foundation of Zhongzhou state in Eastern Europe will be unbreakable. Good. He turned to look at Summer Solstice with a smile. It seems that Tianzong's nomination was correct. Although Tianlan is young, he is really sharp. It's a blessing for the Snowdance Corps and Zhongzhou state to meet such a good commander. Dongqing Wudi and Summer Solstice curled their lips at the same time, but they didn't say anything. Li Huaqing didn't seem to see their expressions. He lowered his head, picked up the phone, and dialed Li Tianlan's number directly. The phone rang twice, and then it was hung up directly. Li Huaqing froze for a moment, and the phone suddenly rang. It was not Li Tianlan who called. It was Gong Sunqi. Li Huaqing hesitated for a moment, put the phone on speaker, and said hello. Mr. President, this is Gong Sunqi. Gong Sunqi's voice sounded calm and indifferent. General Gong Sun, how is the situation in Eastern Europe now? How is Comrade Li Tianlan? Li Huaqing's first question was about Li Tianlan's injury. Gong Sunqi froze for a moment, and his voice seemed to become a little strange. His Highness Tianlan should be fine. Should? Li Huaqing frowned. Well, Gong Sunqi's tone was very complicated. Just now he took Miss Dongqing to the hotel. Li Huaqing blinked and didn't say a word for a long time. It's ridiculous. Summer Solstice seemed to think of something and suddenly scolded him. After the war, there were heavy casualties. As the marshal of Zhongzhou state, he took a woman to the hotel? What kind of marshal was this? Dongqing Wudi was beaming with joy. He squinted at Summer Solstice and suddenly said, Mrs. Wang, after the war, my daughter and my son-in-law went to the hotel to have a rest. How is it ridiculous? He paused, coughed dryly, and said seriously, even if it's ridiculous, what does it have to do with you? Summer Solstice gave Dongqing Wudi a cold look and didn't speak. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, and her style was alluring. Tianlon didn't say anything? After a long time, Li Huaqing asked. Gong Sunqi was silent for a while and said softly, His Highness said that everything next is the business of Zhongzhou state. Li Huaqing narrowed his eyes. Dongqing Wudi was stunned. Summer Solstice gently picked up the teacup and took a sip, as if thinking about something. Thank you for Bai Yang and Qing Qing's support. I've written so badly recently, but I still get a reward. I'm a little embarrassed. These chapters are not good. I'll adjust them as soon as possible. Chapter 528. Li Tianlon really didn't need to do anything. At the age of 22, he became the youngest marshal in the special warfare system of Zhongzhou state, and led the Snowdance Corps into the general trend of Eastern Europe. Li Tianlon and the Snowdance Corps had shown the whole world their spirit. They conquered Rekvia, united with the Qing clan, repelled the Jiang family of South America, dismantled the Shadow Throne, destroyed Morton and Violet, imprisoned the Sword Emperor, and severely damaged the Eastern Church. The holy punishment of Void and the Twilight of the Gods had changed owners. The Snowdance Corps marched 900 miles in a day and swept in all directions. Jiang Qianyan died. Black Ghost died. Lagos died. Hastile died. Charlemagne died. King Tong was disabled. Paul was seriously injured. Eastern Europe might be more chaotic now, but all the forces had completely lost their voice. The will of Zhongzhou state could now move unscrupulously in Wulan state. All of this happened in a short span of 10 days. The answer sheet that Li Tianlon handed in might be full of ups and downs, but judging from the result, it was absolutely perfect. He had done everything he could do. The next step was naturally Zhongzhou state's business. The negotiation with Eastern European countries, how to stabilize the situation in Eastern Europe, and establish its international image. The battles and compromises that happened under the light were all Zhongzhou state's business. Li Huaqing was silent for a long time before he slowly hung up the phone. He hadn't talked to Li Tianlon yet, but the words that Gong Sunqi conveyed made him clearly feel Li Tianlon's boredom and exhaustion. So he gave up the idea of disturbing Li Tianlon, turned to look at Dongqing Wudi and Summer Solstice, and said slowly, What do you think of the situation in Eastern Europe? Dongqing Wudi didn't speak. Tonight he really planned to fight the Wang family of Beihai at all costs. Although this was a war that was doomed to fail, as the real leading wealthy family in Zhongzhou state, the Dongqing clan was also sure to make the Wang family of Beihai suffer heavy losses. A wealthy family like the Dongqing clan was basically at its peak. Specifically, in Zhongzhou state, the Wang family of Beihai might not have any advantage over the Dongqing clan. What made them stronger than the Dongqing clan was the foundation accumulated over hundreds of years, the influence in the world, and the independence of Zhongzhou state. The Dongqing clan was now the real giant in the military. Once Dongqing Wudi fell out with the Wang family of Beihai, even the Dongqing clan would be ruined. How could Zhongzhou state continue to tolerate the Wang family of Beihai? At that time, a Beihai province that had nothing to do with Zhongzhou state, no matter how powerful it was, could not last long without its foundation. The Dongqing clan had completely put on a desperate posture. But fortunately things did not develop to that point. At times like this, Dongqing Wudi had to keep a low profile. At present, if the Snowdance Corps is stable, Eastern Europe will be stable. Summer Solstice was silent for a while, and suddenly said, The predecessor of the Snowdance Corps was the most elite Thunderbolt Battalion in the Border Control Corps. The Border Control Corps was the most elite army of Zhongzhou state. The most elite army of the Border Control Corps was naturally the most elite army of Zhongzhou state. There were less than 10,000 people in the Border Control Corps today, but when combined together, it was enough to make anyone, even an invincible realm expert, tremble. This was undoubtedly the cornerstone of stability in Eastern Europe. With the deterrence of the Snowdance Corps and the strong support of the Arctic Ocean Command in the rear, wherever this force passed, even Snow Country, which had always been strong in military, did not dare to act rashly. Li Huaqing suddenly glanced at Dongqing Wudi. Today's Snowdance Corps were all Dongqing Wudi's old subordinates. In their eyes, they could even disown Zhongzhou state, but they would not disown Dongqing Wudi. Dongqing Wudi still kept his head down, but he nodded calmly. Li Huaqing breathed a sigh of relief and said calmly, Tianlan is still in Eastern Europe. If Tianlan can stabilize, there will be no problem with the Snowdance Corps. No one denies Marshal Li's ability, Summer Solstice said calmly. After the battle that almost made the dark world fall apart, she had adjusted her emotions in the shortest time and began to think about the next situation. But now Marshal Li is supporting the Snowdance Corps alone. I'm afraid he will be under a lot of pressure. Should we assign a helper to Marshal Li to cooperate with his actions in Eastern Europe? Chen Qinghuan, the former vice marshal of the Snowdance Corps, was killed by Li Tianlan on the spot in front of Wang Tianzong. If everything in Eastern Europe failed tonight, and Li Tianlan returned to Zhongzhou State, Chen Qinghuan's death would definitely cause him great trouble. If all kinds of troubles were superimposed together, they would become a sharp knife that would stab Li Tianlan, and even the Li family beyond redemption. But now Li Tianlan had taken over Eastern Europe. It was no exaggeration to say that Li Tianlan's contribution tonight was as great as the benefits in Eastern Europe. At this time, Summer Solstice naturally would not ask for a rebuff by mentioning Chen Qinghuan. Indeed, Li Huaqing glanced at Summer Solstice with a smile. The Wang family of Beihai is full of talents. Who can I recommend? The Wang family of Beihai's defense task is very heavy. I'm afraid we can't spare any manpower. What if we make some big shots unhappy and send troops to destroy the Beihai Corps? Now who dares to leave the Beihai Corps? Summer Solstice glanced at Dongqing Wudi with a faint smile. Dongqing Wudi was expressionless and said nothing. From the moment Li Tianlan won and ordered the army to retreat, he knew very well that he could not fight for anything tonight. If he had not dispatched the army to fight against the Wang family of Beihai, after Li Tianlan's great victory, the Dongqing clan could have replaced the vice-marshal of the Snowdance Corps with their own people. But now Li Tianlan had won. But the army also appeared in front of the world. Dongqing Wudi was in trouble. Even if he proposed the vice-marshal of the Snowdance Corps, it was impossible to pass the decision-making committee. What was more, the Snowdance Corps was a special warfare battalion. Before I came here, I communicated with Secretary Wang of Wuyue and His Highness Gu Xingyun. They thought that it was a little inappropriate to send Chen Qinghuan to Eastern Europe. He couldn't adapt to Marshal Li's thinking at all, which proved it. So His Highness Gu Xingyun said that this time, we should simply assign a young man to Marshal Li, so that he can better cooperate with Marshal Li. In a sense, youth meant no qualifications and no prestige. Naturally, it was difficult to threaten Li Tianlan's status. But if it was those two... The muscles at the corners of Li Huaqing's eyes twitched slightly. He chuckled and said, Who did Xingyun recommend? Gu Hanshan? Or Wang Shengxiao? I'm afraid that Marshal Li has a misunderstanding about our two families. If they go there, it will be counterproductive, so we should send a relatively neutral person there. Summer Solstice smiled and said, How about Jiang Shangyu? Jiang Shangyu? Li Huaqing repeated the sentence in surprise. Dongqing Wudi also raised his eyebrows. Zhongzhou State had always paid great attention to the growth of the young generation. If not, the final maneuver of the two academies every 3 years would not have become a grand event of the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State. Now it seemed that there were 4 young people who were absolutely sure to break through to the invincible realm in the next 20 years. Li Tianlan didn't need to say more. After Li Tianlan, there were Wang Shengxiao with wind and thunder veins and Gu Hanshan with heavenly king heart. These two were the heirs of the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City respectively. It seemed that even if the Li family rose again, these two families could still continue to be glorious in the future. In addition, the last one was Jiang Shangyu. In the final maneuver, everyone saw Jiang Shangyu's performance. This young man, who had been stuck in the fire-flaming realm for more than 3 years, had found his own way. Now, in the eyes of many people, his future was even more promising than Gu Hanshan's. Let Jiang Shangyu be the vice-marshal of the Snowdance Corps? Li Huaqing took a deep look at Summer Solstice. If this was the meaning of the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City, was there kindness or malice behind this appointment? But whether it was kindness or malice, if this appointment was really passed. There was no doubt that Jiang Shangyu really had a meteoric rise. Dong Qingwudi was also looking at summer solstice. His brows furrowed subconsciously. For some reason at this moment, he suddenly thought of Qin Weibai and Samsara Palace. Chen Qingwan was killed. When the Snowdance Corps needed to appoint a new vice-marshal, Wang Qinglei of Wuyue communicated with Gu Xingyun. And then Summer Solstice nominated Jiang Shangyu as the vice-marshal of the Snowdance Corps. All of this seemed normal. Everything was normal. There was nothing out of place. But Dong Qingwudi always felt that there was a familiar but inexplicable feeling in it. He frowned and was lost in thought. There was silence in the study for a while. Summer Solstice drank water silently and stopped talking. It was impossible for Wang Tianzong to come back from Eastern Europe now. Even if Eastern Europe had fallen into Li Tianlan's hands, he was about to break through. If he left Eastern Europe at this time, he would take a step back at the most critical time. He would not retreat. But the general trend in Eastern Europe had been settled, and Li Tianlan had made great contributions. It was unrealistic to charge him with treason. Under such circumstances, arranging for Jiang Shangyu to enter the Snowdance Corps was undoubtedly treating Jiang Shangyu as a knife to compete with Li Tianlan. Jiang Shangyu would be a good knife, but in front of Li Tianlan, it was inevitable that he was not sharp enough. However, in the Snowdance Corps, as long as he could slightly check and balance Li Tianlan, or even keep an eye on Li Tianlan's traces, it would be enough. Summer Solstice glanced at Dong Qingwudi and thought, "You think too highly of your good son-in-law." The Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City wanted to move against Li Tianlan, but in fact everyone wanted to move against the Li family most. Since it was not easy to move against Li Tianlan, some of the Li family's subordinates were still in Eastern Europe. For Wang Tianzong, who was about to break through, if he didn't move against Li Tianlan and directly attack the Purgatory of Heaven capital, he could also hit the Li family hard. After tonight, the Purgatory of Heaven capital was one of the few foreign forces that had not withdrawn from Eastern Europe. The Sword Emperor attacked the Purgatory of Heaven capital and completely occupied the general trend. This was what he should do. Whether it was Li Tianlan or the Li family, no one in Zhongzhou state could say anything. A Sword Emperor without any hindrances from behind was undoubtedly the most terrifying thing. Of course, it would be better if Jiang Shangyu could create some small surprises in the process. Dong Qingwudi picked up the teacup and drank without saying a word. In the high-level meeting that was held immediately afterwards, you're tuning in to the Echoes of the Heart YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.